Ladies and gentlemen, today is March the 19th, 2023. It's 8:20 in the PM time, and we are here to talk about what in the heck is going on in the world. And we have none other than our very own Agent Smith to talk about it. Without any further delays, let's jump in with Agent Smith. Smith.
Hello.
Yo.
Hey, how are you?
Doing all right. How are you doing, sir?
Doing okay.
Yeah.
Can't complain.
Well, Chat's really good at complaining, so Chat, if you could help him out, complain about some stuff, just give some examples of things that you would like to complain about. You have the floor.
Oh,
We have
my work ethic.
your work ethic. You wish you had more of it. That's fair.
Need to do more.
Need to do more stuff. Some people's arms are hurting. Some people are complaining about the different Zerg races or StarCraft races against Zerg. Someone's back hurts. We have a whole slew of topics that people wanted to have discussed today. I just asked Chat like an hour ago if they had any ideas of things they wanted to hit on. So when you ask, is there anything that caught your eye, I can say lots of stuff.
Yeah, I heard you talking about some of it a while ago.
Yeah. We've also got someone who asked a random off-the-cuff question that I don't know if you know much about, but they asked about the oldest known religions and the origins of religion. And I told them that that wasn't really what you focused on studying, but who knows, maybe you did.
No, I can't say I've read anything about that particular subject. If I had to guess, I would say it was probably just some rudimentary local folk religions that we'll probably never know anything about. Yeah, not a lot of records from tens of thousands of years ago, unfortunately.
Yeah, oral tradition would have started before writing. And I would guess that forms of religion, superstition, that kind of thing existed before writing by maybe 100,000 years to a million.
Yeah, pretty long time.
As long as there have been lightning bolts that people didn't understand the scientific explanation for, there have been thunder gods.
Exactly.
We got a lot of fresh stuff to hit this week. Let's just pick a random one here. France is having a lot of protests, and some people have described it as a political crisis. People have tweeted about the situation, what's going on in France.
Yeah, yeah, I've read about that. I don't know that I would agree it's a crisis. You know, the protests are definitely pretty large, but I doubt that they're going to be able to achieve their objective. Have you been following this at all?
I think some of it has to do with retirement age, but I haven't been following it closely.
Yeah, yeah, you're spot on. It has to do with pensions. So the government wants to raise the retirement age by what I think like 2 years or something like that, and people are very upset about that. And they came out and protested in order to try to stop the government from implementing the reform, but the government still tried to push it through. However, the government found that ultimately they did not have enough votes to get it passed through the legislature. So, President Macron decided to impose the reform using a provision in France's constitution that allows the executive to unilaterally pass legislation in certain circumstances. And apparently, those circumstances were met. So the reform went through, but it went through in a very undemocratic way that people are even more upset about than even just the original reform. So that's resulted in a big spike in unrest in France. And people are saying that they're going to keep protesting until the government repeals the change. But I'm pretty skeptical that's going to happen.
What was the change exactly?
Pretty much just raising the retirement age. There's more detail to it than that. You know, there's a bunch of exemptions for people who work certain kinds of jobs and other types of things like that. But the gist of it is that they raised the retirement age, I think, from something like 62 to 65, something in that ballpark. I don't have the notes in front of me, so I don't know the exact numbers.
For reference, it's 65 in the U.S., right?
Um, we don't have a retirement age per se. What we have is just an age at which you qualify for Social Security.
Hmm.
So you don't actually have to retire, I don't think, to get those. Is that right? Am I remembering that correctly? I suddenly can't remember. But yeah, it's pretty similar. I think it's like mid upper 60s or so.
Let's not bash French people as a general demographic, chat. Holy crap.
What?
Chat just getting really pissy.
Getting excited again, huh?
Yeah, there's a bit of U.S.-French rivalry, I think. A lot of the general stances that the countries take end up opposing sometimes. So France has stereotypes about the U.S. being brutish and materialistic and short-sighted and so on, and then America has stereotypes about the French as surrendering all the time and being lazy and so on. These are stereotypes, Chad. Every country that has hundreds of millions of people is going to have a full range from the most hardworking to the least hardworking and so on. Use your brain. Don't bash people. Thank you. All right.
Well, they really ought to get along more. France and the United States have a lot in common.
Yeah. Probably more than they want to admit.
Yeah. Yeah, the French ideas had a lot of influence on the United States, especially when it was forming back in the 1700s. The idea of forming a republic, that was, I think, more of a French idea than an English idea, even though France didn't have a republic at the time. And France also has a very similar approach to immigrants. France is very, very assimilationist regarding how it treats its immigrant population. And the United States has more in common with that approach than it does with the British approach.
What is the British approach?
It's more basically Canada.
Uh-huh.
It's much more multicultural in nature.
Yeah, so with France and the US, it's like we welcome anyone, just kind of do stuff our way once you join up. Whereas England and Canada is more, you can keep practicing your own ways and stuff and live here and just do your own thing.
Yeah, up to a point. Canada and the UK definitely still have their conservatives who would prefer a more assimilationist approach. But yeah, more broadly speaking, the US has more in common with France in that regard. It's also a little more, it has more in common with France in terms of egalitarianism as well. Britain has not really had as much of a history of upholding those ideas. Which is not to say that they don't have egalitarian political impulses. Obviously they have a much stronger left-wing labor movement and party than the United States does. But the ethos in British society is maybe a little less egalitarian than in the United States, I would argue. We don't have like actual aristocrats. We have no House of Lords.
We do have people who are super rich.
We do. We do have super rich, but we don't really give them assigned seats in our upper legislative body.
Right, yeah. We just let them pay off the people in the upper legislative body.
Much more modern, much more forward thinking.
So I guess we'll see if they make any adjustments based on the protests and so on. But that's kind of a if they want to situation rather than a super threatening pressure on the government. Because I would guess there are going to be some people who are happy about this going through. They're going to see it as, okay, now we're being more productive. It's going to boost our economy.
It's really not even about boosting the economy. It's really much more about trying to manage France's finances. The government spends quite a bit of money and has quite a bit of debt, so there's a perceived need to try to trim the fat, so to speak, to try to cut the budget a little bit, to try to get long-term projections on a more stable footing. So if you can increase retirement age, that makes it a little bit easier. That reduces costs over the long run.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, we'll see what happens, but for now it's just very restive in France. But I doubt they're going to be able to force the government to give way on it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Not so much because the change was just really popular. It was not, clearly. But I don't think the protesters are going to be able to generate enough votes in the legislature to change minds, even if they're very disruptive.
Mm-hmm.
So I suspect it's going to stick as is.
Kind of makes me wonder how often things like these protests actually work, because we've seen Iran go through a wave of protests recently that wasn't really able to accomplish too much, as far as I know.
Mm.
Israel now has big protests. I don't know if you had an update on that situation, if there is any.
No, not really. I don't think I've read anything recently. Yeah, people are still muttering about civil war, so that's possibly on the table. That would certainly be another major event for 2023. Hopefully not, but it would certainly be in keeping with the themes of the decades thus far.
Yeah.
But yeah, you're right. Mass protests have not had a great track record over the past 10, 20 years. Yeah, part of that is just difficulty with organizing, especially here in the United States. People are very skeptical about centralized leadership, so they prefer these sort of distributed, decentralized networks of opposition. But, while those can generate a lot of support and get people out on the streets, they tend to struggle to leverage that base of support into actual political power.
Mm-hmm.
And so that results in a lack of tangible gains in terms of votes, legislature, what have you. Yeah, the 2020 protests were kind of a good case study in that sense, because obviously there was a lot of support, for change. There was certainly a lot of anger about what happened to George Floyd and then against the police and whatnot. So, you could be forgiven for thinking that would be operationalized into significant reforms, but mostly you just saw sporadic reforms at a local level, and even a lot of those have petered out over the past couple of years. It's hard to believe it's already been, 3 years since 2020. Well, 2 years and change, but time flies. It's been a very eventful couple of years.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't feel like 2020 was just a couple of years ago. But that just illustrates how difficult it is to kind of manage a mass protest, to kind of turn that into actual political capital that you can use to incur some kind of real change.
Yeah, and the thing that I learned from the Occupy protests a while back was a big crowd of people has a lot of different opinions going around in it, and it can be hard to distill that into some action item that you want pushed through government in the normal channels. It's pretty complicated because a lot of people who just have general concerns or angst about the current state of affairs will show up, but they aren't necessarily going to give you the best momentum when it comes to, okay, you want to work on this one thing. Chad is saying that a recent protest that was successful was the protest in Korea regarding the corruption allegations to get them to resign.
Oh, the impeachment?
Yeah.
Yeah, I remember that. Yeah, that was pretty successful, but even if there hadn't been protests, she probably would have been impeached. That was a pretty clear-cut case of corruption there. I
Mm-hmm.
don't doubt that the opposition in government would have jumped at that, regardless of, the public's response.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, having, actual politicians in government kind of on your side and willing to go to bat for you, that's also very helpful. But that preference for decentralized networks kind of makes that a little harder.
Mm-hmm.
And there's also been kind of a trend of sort of flash movements over the past 20 years. People will come out and protest hard for a month or a couple months, but then the support kind of fades pretty quickly as people move on to the next thing.
Mm-hmm.
And so the result is that they've inadvertently trained politicians to be patient. Like if you can just wait a while, there's a
Just
pretty
wait until
decent
they get
chance.
bored and go away.
Yeah, yeah. And very frequently that works. That's kind of always worked. That's always a viable strategy when dealing with public discontent, but
Mm-hmm.
particularly so when you're dealing with these sort of temporary spouts of anger that crop up.
Mm-hmm.
Without further organization, they lack staying power.
Mm-hmm. So
Yeah, part
there,
of the. Sorry, go ahead.
I was just saying there was the French protests recently, the Israeli one, and you said that the protests in Iran have mostly petered out at this point.
Yeah, for the most part. Yeah, part of the reason protests haven't been as successful too over the past the past 10 years or so is that some of them have been in, authoritarian countries. In order for mass protests to work, it really helps to have either a democratic government or a government that is trying to maintain the pretense of democracy.
Mm-hmm.
So that's part of the reason the protests were able to grow as much as they did in Iran. Iran maintains that it is a nominally democratic state. They do have elections. And sometimes they're almost competitive, but the issue is that the government very strictly polices who is allowed to run in those elections and has become significantly more strict over the past 5 years in particular, to the point where it's basically just theater at this point.
Mm-hmm.
That is to say, democracy is just theater there. Whereas before, there were options. They were not really, they didn't have options that represented the full gamut of the country's political spectrum. But, you did have a choice that would have something resembling a substantive impact on the country's politics. That's very much no longer the case at this point, and hasn't been for a while.
Sounds a little bit like how China fields their politicians as well. Like you can vote for people, but they're coming from the same party and they get to choose who gets to run. So pretty limited set.
That's an interesting point, because there actually are cases in China where they have allowed other people to run. It doesn't
People,
happen a whole lot.
would these be
And
people who
generally,
have a good shot at winning, or it's kind of like we'll throw them a bone by letting them run, like that demographic, letting one of their people run, but they don't actually have a shot at winning, so they don't feel like they're going to lose anything?
sometimes it's somebody who has some support. It doesn't happen a whole lot because a lot of, local governments and whatnot don't like dissent, obviously.
Mm.
But there are some provinces or maybe prefectural governments that are willing to allow some experimentation with open elections. And sometimes they actually have allowed multiple candidates to run. You're never allowed to run as like a different party,
Mm.
other than the Communist Party or, I don't know, maybe one of the like 6 other parties that are technically legal but are actually controlled by the Communist Party. But I've never heard of that happening. Generally, in the cases that I'm familiar with anyway, the quote unquote opposition, so to speak, has always just been independent candidates.
Mm.
So basically just individual people running. So they may not be members of the Communist Party, but they're not inherently disloyal to the Communist Party either. I would point out again that this is only at a local level. They're not doing this ever at a provincial level or certainly not a national level. But yeah, there was, I think, probably the most famous case of this happening at a local level was a village called Wukon, if I'm not mistaken. It was a village in southeastern China, and this was way back in like 2011 or so, which doesn't feel that long ago to me.
Mm.
I have to remind myself that it was more than a decade ago. But yeah, that was a big story that I was following at the time. There was a village where the party, well, where the guy in charge was a party member and he was corrupt and he was pissing people off because he was doing what, all of the local governments were doing, which is that he was taking land and selling it in order to make revenue for the local government, which of course, a significant portion of was pocketed by this, that, or the other local elite politician. And maybe that's not necessarily too much of a problem, but sometimes they would just kick people off their land and sell that land without really properly compensating them. And that's an excellent way to piss people off.
Mm-hmm.
Given that this was not like a big urban area, this was a rural village in southeastern China. So land is everything. So if you lose your land and you're not given proper compensation, you're really screwed. So people got upset about that. The village elder, as I recall, decided to stand up in the election and run against the party. And then the local party apparatus responded very negatively to that. And ultimately, they'd arrested the guy.
Mm.
And then the village freaked the fuck out. It was wild to follow. You would not hear about this happening today. It could still happen today, but you would never hear about it because back then, foreign media had much more leeway in China. There was a lot more foreign journalists running around, which is the only reason we know about this. So what happened is that the villagers just straight up kicked all of the party officials in the village out of the village.
Hmm.
Just rounded them up, kicked them out, and they installed their guy as head of the local government. That village elder who was arrested. And for a while afterwards, there was a standoff between what I think were provincial police and the village. They surrounded the village and they were negotiating with them and talking about how to resolve the issue. And so for maybe a couple weeks, maybe like 2 weeks or so, I was following that story in the foreign news, trying to figure out like what was going to happen to the people of Wukon. And you know how the internet is. There's always the people who kind of engage in hyperbole. They were talking about, could this be like a revolution? Is this the people rising up? And the answer is no. A common theme in Chinese politics is that people at a local level always, or at least always pretend, to blame local problems, local corruption, etc., on issues with the local Communist Party, not with the national Communist Party. Mm-hmm. Everybody says or pretends anyway that the national government is inherently good and that problems are solely the responsibility of the local government and that the national government just needs to be made aware of the problem so that they can come in and fix it. Mm-hmm. So that's the kind of game that people play. You actually can protest against the government in China and challenge officials, but it's only really at a local level. Beyond that, the most you can do is petition provincial level government or national level government. And even that is pretty mixed bag. They may or may not hear your petition, and even if they hear your petition, they're under no obligation to do anything about it. But you can try. It's better than nothing. So it's not true that you have no recourse in China if the government engages in misbehavior, but it's much more limited than it is in other countries, certainly. It's still an authoritarian state. Yeah, I think with Wukon, the party eventually just negotiated an agreement where the party would be able to return to the village and get their guy back in charge in exchange for allowing the village elder to serve on the council. It's like the village presidium or whatever it is, basically a local council that kind of helps manage affairs. It's not the same thing as like a city council like you would see here in the United States, but it's kind of similar. So that seemed to sate the villagers. But yeah, that's an example. So it can happen. And I also knew a professor when I was in grad school. I actually took a class on Chinese politics with him, which is kind of where I learned most of this. And he actually gave me a data set so that I could use it in a paper that I was writing for the class. And the data set had to do with democracy in China. So specifically elections, like it tracked which localities had had borderline open elections and kind of tracked it over time. So it was a thing that the party was allowing localities to experiment with for a while. They've since stopped that. Xi Jinping came in, and the party has definitely taken a hard left turn,
Mm-hmm.
since he came in, and so they've backed off a lot of that quasi-liberalization they were toying with, unfortunately. But I would just highlight that as a counterexample to the point you made that, you can't run against the party in China. For the most part, that's true, but there were examples where it did happen. And there might be examples, very rare ones, in obscure localities where they might still do it.
So on a national level, I was correct. On a local level, I was not correct. It
Oh,
seems
you're
like
half correct.
yeah, it seems like they allow the local government to kind of be fallible because that is a nice way to contrast the national government. It's like, oh yeah, they can have problems, but we're always there looking out for your best interests.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's a smart way to do it because it kind of gives people a pressure valve,
Mm-hmm.
right? It doesn't threaten the national government or the party's legitimacy, but at the same time, it does give people a means by which to challenge wrongdoing and corruption in the party.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, if you just didn't allow any kind of unrest or dissent, then it would be much harder to keep track of corruption. The party recognizes that corruption is a problem. It even openly admits it,
Mm-hmm.
which a lot of people don't really give them credit for outside of China. But the party has tried to make this a public issue that it tries to address. Nobody can say openly that the way to address it is to have, a multi-party system. That's beyond the pale for Chinese politics. But you can say openly that corruption is an issue and that the party needs to address it. They actually even made a TV show about it.
Nice.
Yeah, you remember House of Cards, right?
I remember the show. I haven't seen it, but I
Yeah.
remember when it was a thing.
So China basically made their own version of that, sort of, or at least people made a lot of comparisons to it, in the sense that it was about a corrupt Chinese official. So a lot of people were surprised when they heard about that because they didn't think China would ever allow a TV show like that to be released in China, but they did. That was a part of the government's anti-corruption push when Xi Jinping came to power. The party was quite willing to concede that corruption was an issue and tried to raise awareness of it. And part of that was kind of recognizing the legitimacy of complaints about corruption, but also trying to build the state's legitimacy by showing that it recognized there was a problem and it was taking steps to deal with it. Yeah, the Communist Party of China is, it's brutal, it's authoritarian, it does not tolerate dissent, but it's not stupid for the most part, right? They actually know their shit
Mm-hmm.
a lot of the time. They've made mistakes and continue to make certain mistakes, but people kind of shortchange the ability of authoritarian political parties to manage their affairs. People kind of have very negative assumptions about them in the West in particular, but there are times when they can be relatively well run.
Yeah, they certainly are doing some things right if they're able to manage that many people and maintain control, as we've seen
Yeah.
with a lot of countries. If the governing body isn't making sure things are productive and pleasant enough for the citizens, then they will find some new leadership. But yeah, there was a question from chat regarding a meeting between Putin and Xi Jinping. Apparently that happened recently, and they were wondering what the ramifications of that are.
So that's a good question, but nobody knows the answer to that. Certainly not me, and won't know the answer to that until probably weeks or months from now, because that's probably how long it'll take for any kind of agreement they make to become manifest in the behavior of one or the other state.
Mm-hmm.
And it may be that they didn't agree on anything of substance. It may be that the meeting was mostly just for show, just giving token support, but otherwise not coming to any kind of consensus about how to deal with the whole Ukraine situation.
Mm-hmm.
It's impossible to know, basically, one way or the other.
So it was more of a private meeting then between the two of them, not a press
Yeah.
conference. Gotcha.
Oh, yeah. I mean, they're still like authoritarian leaders. They're not going to do like an open source type thing where you can just kind of where they openly talk about what they talked about and share it with local press. Yeah, they don't do that.
Not really their style.
No, unfortunately not. So people are going to be guessing for a while to see what comes out of this. The big question is whether or not China will send, lethal assistance. Let's go with that. Ammunition, military vehicles, also dual use equipment, things like they're already sending dual use equipment, so not so much that, but vehicles and ammunition in particular are what Washington is watching for.
Dual use equipment is equipment that you can use twice, or equipment that you would use in a duel?
Neither. Dual use equipment is equipment that can be, well, in this context, it refers to equipment that can be used either in a civilian capacity or a military capacity.
Like drilling equipment.
Drilling equipment, yeah. Things like semiconductors are a good example. You can use those to make washing machines, but depending on the type of semiconductor anyway, you can also use them in missiles or other military equipment. So China is providing dual-use equipment. It's not entirely known exactly how much they're sending, but we do know they're selling them semiconductors and other varieties of that kind of equipment. But it's not known yet whether or not they've been sending weapons, and if they are, how significant that is. And also, I think the government does not think they are. At least the U.S. government has said publicly it doesn't think they're sending weapons as of now. But the other question, of course, is if they're not sending weapons, will they send significant amounts in the future? So that's not known either. And I think that's the latter question is more what they're looking for. I did see a report that there was Chinese ammunition, or rather, ammunition that had been manufactured in China was found to have been used by the Russians in Ukraine recently, like in the past week. But it's not known as of yet whether or not that ammunition was sent specifically by the Chinese government as aid, or if it was just bought off of the secondary market, or if maybe the Russians had just bought it from the Chinese and without them knowing that it was going to Ukraine, or just some kind of alternative arrangement than just pure Chinese military aid. Like, just the nature of how the ammo got there is not known yet. So that could turn into a big story if it turns out to have actually been Chinese military aid. But for now, we don't know. And probably, I would guess, it was just bought off of the secondary market. The Russian government has been going out of its way to buy a bunch of ammunition from places like North Korea, Iran, and also Africa, and pretty much anywhere that received a lot of Soviet aid during the Cold War has lots of Soviet ammunition just kind of lying around. And Moscow has been trying to buy it back.
So I'm not really a guns expert, but we did talk about the difference in planes between Soviet built and Western built. That's like US and UK and so on. For these types of ammunition, it's gun specific. Like you can't use ammo for a American assault rifle in a Russian one.
For the most part, yes. It basically just comes down to caliber. If it's a 7.62 round, then it's going to be too big for a NATO standard weapon. I think, chat can correct me. I'll do the usual disclaimer here. This is going to be a good point for it. I'm not an expert in everything I talk about, more obvious at sometimes than others. So if I ever say anything wrong, stupid, or biased, please do correct me. If I'm wrong, I want to know more than anybody. I don't read chat while we do this, but I will read it later, and I do enjoy the feedback I get. So participation by chat is encouraged in that regard. So that said, If memory serves, the AK-47 uses 7.62 millimeter rounds, and the NATO standard ammunition for NATO weaponry is 5.56 millimeter ammunition. So different sizes, basically, of bullets will fit only with weapons that are designed for it. And because the Soviet Union and NATO had different standards, the ammunition for their respective weapons was not interchangeable.
Gotcha.
Now, that said, the Russians actually did start building a rifle that I think was called the AK-101. It's too bad Kukio isn't here. He would know. He knew all of the gun stuff.
Yep.
He was very good with that. I think it was called the AK-101, and what it was is basically, to simplify it, it was basically an AK-47 that had been redesigned to NATO standard. So instead of having 7.62, it was 5.56. So that particular rifle actually could use 5.56 NATO standard ammunition. And I think I read that that was a not unpopular choice among some of the former Warsaw Pact countries that were used to using Kalashnikovs, but also had a lot of NATO standard ammunition after they joined NATO. I think Venezuela also bought a whole bunch of those. So basically, the Russians do have some weapons that can use NATO standard ammo. Although I don't know that the AK-101 was widely adopted in the Russian army itself. I think that was mostly made for export. I think they were still using a lot of the old Soviet standard stuff and still use that today. But yeah, Russia can't, well, I mean, they can't really buy much from the West in general right now, regardless, but also the West doesn't produce, at least I don't think they produce 7.62 ammo. So if Russia wants to buy a bunch off of the open market, they're going to have to buy from places that had bought ammunition from Russia or had received ammunition as a form of aid from the Soviet Union in some previous era. China would be a really great source because they do have pretty decent sized armories that can produce that ammunition. But again, it's not known if they're doing that already or if they're willing to do it if they're not. So that may not be an option for Moscow, unfortunately for them.
So I guess we'll see. That would be considered an escalation from the West if they did see like widespread sale of Chinese ammunition. Because yeah, it doesn't really mean necessarily that they bought it from China just because they're using bullets that were made in China. There could have been an intermediary there.
Yeah. And it could be that China is working through that intermediary. Maybe that they're trying to be slick.
Yeah, true.
And trying to get around the West. That's also a possibility. It's just unknown right now. From what I've been reading on Twitter, for what that's worth, there have been ammunition shortages reported all along the front amongst Russian forces. So that would somewhat discount the notion that China is already giving them ammunition. Or if they are giving them ammunition, they're not giving enough. That's assuming those reports are accurate. But if they are, probably China's not leaning in to help Russia a lot here, at least not yet. But yeah, to bring this full circle, protests do tend to struggle in authoritarian countries. It's just inherently difficult because in either a liberal democracy or even in an illiberal democracy, public pressure goes further, right? The government doesn't have as many tools to respond to that. But in an authoritarian country, they always have the option to just crack down. And that makes it a little easier for the government to suppress dissent, since they always have that last resort ready to go if they think that the protests are getting too big. And of course, they also have the benefit of not having to deal with rule of law. So, if there's some particular group of people or individuals that you think or have identified as being leaders of a given movement, they can just disappear. And they don't really have anything they can do about that. So that's also a benefit. You can really effectively defang a movement by targeting the leadership. That was certainly a popular move during the Cold War by both the United States and the Soviet Union. Pretty effective if you can do it.
We're going to protest against your oppression of us. Joke's on you. We're an authoritarian regime and we don't give a shit.
Well, that is pretty accurate. Yeah. That's pretty much what they do. Yeah, Iran, again, kind of pretends to be a democracy, so they were willing to kind of give them more, relatively speaking, of a free hand in the protests, but eventually they did crack down. And that really put a dent in the protest movement pretty significantly. That doesn't mean it's all over. You know, the economic conditions are sufficiently bad and dissent is sufficiently widespread that they could start protesting again. Mm-hmm. But it's just not clear if that'll be any more successful the second time than it was the first time. Yeah, protests really are most effective when they're part of an overarching strategy, right? When it's just one variable among many that are in play. So, you know, mass protests communicate public dissent, but it also helps to have political elites who disagree with each other, who some of whom may be willing to ally with the movement. That also kind of needs to be in effect, you know, that needs to be a factor. And then international pressure also is very useful. So, you know, if your protest movement is attracting international attention and other countries that have a lot of leverage over your country are willing to put pressure on the government, that can also help. You know, so generally when you see mass protests succeed, it's a combination of different factors that result in the success of the movement, if it does end up succeeding. You know, international pressure, internal pressure within the regime, and then street pressure all together are not always sufficient to incur change, but in the cases where that has worked, you know, generally it required all three, if not also other factors that I can't even think of off the top of my head. So if all you've got is people on the street, that's not enough. And similarly, if all you have is international pressure, that's generally not enough. And if all you have is bickering within the regime, that's not enough. You know, multiple factors have to all come together in order to produce significant political change. It's one of the reasons that protest movements in the United States have it a little harder. Mm-hmm. We have a lot more freedom in the United States, so it's much easier to protest and organize a movement here. But the fact that pretty much no other country can really pressure the United States means that there's pretty much always a lack of international pressure, or at least substantive international pressure. So that's a tool that is missing from the toolbox of American dissent. That's not something we can rely on, whereas people in other countries actually can use that.
Yeah, that makes sense. If the international pressures are lessened, then you would need more national pressure to change something.
Yeah. Yeah, it's the 20th anniversary of the invasion of Iraq. So there's been a bunch of Iraq stuff, you know, on YouTube and whatnot. And, you know, I remember specifically Russian nationalists complaining at times after they were receiving backlash because of the invasion of Ukraine. They were complaining, you know, why didn't countries around the world sanction the United States when it invaded Iraq? And that was just never going to happen. That was never a realistic possibility. Like, whoever sanctions the United States is going to do a lot more harm to them than they ever would to the United States, because there's just not any other country that has the economic leverage that would be necessary in order to inflict significant economic pain on the United States. Such that they would be doing more damage to the U.S. than on themselves.
Does China sanction us at all?
They actually, well, they have applied personal sanctions, right, where they identify an individual and basically place sanctions that say they cannot travel to China and that they cannot trade in China and that kind of stuff. But that doesn't really matter. Most of the people they go after are politicians who weren't going to China anyway. So they have token sanctions, basically, but not like the big sweeping sanctions, like what the United States imposes. China actually does have the legal foundation in place to apply American-style sanctions on other countries, although they're mostly designed for the United States, but they haven't actually implemented them yet. They've kind of been sitting on their hands. And there's been some debate online, amongst analysts about why that is exactly. And I think the best explanation is that they're afraid of escalation. If they apply sanctions that actually do have a disruptive impact on the U.S. economy, there would be retaliation, and probably there would be a very good chance of a tit-for-tat series of escalations. They wouldn't necessarily escalate into violence, but economically, it would be very, very disruptive for China. And one could even say that the United States, and this is highly debatable, but one could argue that the United States has escalatory dominance over China in terms of tit-for-tat economic sanctions. And in that sense, China actually has an incentive to avoid them. That's a possible explanation. But again, that depends on, being able to prove escalatory dominance, and that can be a little fuzzy. But yeah, the popular theory, and the one that I think is the best, is that China just doesn't want to start any shit right now. They've got lots of problems in their domestic economy, and the party isn't looking to add to those problems by incurring a bunch of disruptions to foreign trade.
What are their main problems right now, domestically?
I mean, do you want to talk like the temporary ones or like the big fat structural ones?
The big fat structural ones.
The big fat structural ones. Okay, so one, demographics. You've probably heard of this. The population actually is shrinking in China. And that's a problem because demographic growth is actually an important source of economic growth. You may have heard of the demographic dividend, wherein you have a young growing population that is generating lots of economic growth. That can really power an economy. So China is not going to benefit from that in future. Demographic dividends can come with problems of their own. I would refer you to India for an example of that. But in general, it's considered a positive factor. So China's going to lose that. That's going to be a big headwind. Also, the aging of China's society is going to create a lot more elderly dependents that are going to be a drain on China's government at the same time that the people paying in to the government via taxes is going to be shrinking. So the ratio between working age population and retirees is going to become more disfavorable as the population gets older on average. Sometimes that gets a little oversold, I feel, because it's, if you have a young growing population, you also have dependents in the form of children. So education is also another expense there that can kind of drain from your working age population. But kids can grow into productive, taxpayers. Elderly people just kind of die. Mm-hmm. And so it's a different dynamic. And it's one that is going to put a lot more pressure on Beijing's finances, which is where the bigger issue there is. They'll probably be able to manage that, but that's just one more structural factor that's going to be draining their budget at a time when they're going to have a lot of other responsibilities and obligations that they're going to need that money for. So there's going to be a lot of fiscal pressure. There's going to be a major headwind on economic growth. I think those are the two main ones as far as demographics. Other structural factors, I think the other main structural factor, if not the principal one in general, has to do with consumption in China's economy. So developing countries frequently depend on things like exports to kind of initiate their shift into a middle income or developed income or middle income or upper income status. And then also investment is another major driver of economic growth for developing countries as they invest in infrastructure. Frequently, developing countries are severely lacking in infrastructure, and that itself is actually a pretty significant barrier to economic growth. So using revenues from what is generally export-driven growth, they'll redirect that money either directly through the state or through state-owned banks uh, into infrastructure projects in order to help, jumpstart sustainable economic growth. So China actually still has that model. Exports are not nearly as important as they used to be, but the state is still disproportionately dependent on state-directed investment into the economy. And that's especially a problem because China is into the realm of diminishing returns as far as infrastructure investment. There definitely was a time when they needed a lot, and that by dumping money into it, they actually were generating significant future economic growth. But most of the railroads, roads, bridges, etc., that China needed to build in order to kind of lay the foundation for future economic growth have already been built. And by dumping more money into infrastructure at this point, they're not really getting a lot out of it. The return on investment on infrastructure projects in China, if not public investment in general, has been falling over time, significantly so over the past 10 years in particular. So at this point, it's not really about generating economic growth. It's more of a crutch at this point that the Communist Party is using in order to try to manage the economy. After the 2008 financial crisis, there was a big hit all over the global economy. China was no exception. They took a hit too. And in order to try to avoid mass layoffs and potential subsequent political unrest, the party dumped money into investment, again, through state-owned banks, via state-owned banks that the government directed to invest in infrastructure projects, as well as certain, key strategic industries, particularly the steel industry, in order to try to offset the loss in jobs that the not collapse, but that the global recession incurred in China. And, that worked, but it didn't generate much in terms of long-term gains. If you invest money, you want to invest it in something that's going to give you a good return. And that's not just about, getting your money back or maximizing returns. That's also about using the money efficiently. Because if you're getting a good return, that means the thing you invested in is profitable. It's self-sustaining. Not much in it, well, really increasingly less of the stuff that the Chinese government directs state lenders to lend into is self-sustaining. A lot of it is either not making money or is even losing money. And you can only do that for so long before you start running out of money. Over the long term, you will just not be able to invest anymore. It's not viable over the long term. So what China has been trying to do over the past 10 years in particular, and probably with increasing urgency going forward, is to shift the economy from one that is driven by exports and investment to one that is driven by domestic consumption. The party itself has talked about what it calls a circular economy, something like that. The Europeans talk about that too, but they use it in a very different context. In China, that's mostly talking about becoming more self-sufficient, becoming less dependent on trade. Partly that's a strategic thing, so that they're less vulnerable to disruptions from foreign countries, i.e. the United States. But also it's about trying to have the principal dominant economic drivers in China's economy be domestic and also private in nature, rather than public and foreign in nature. Consumption-driven economies defined modern high-income countries. Modern high-income economies, rather. So, Europe, the United States, etc. To a lesser degree, Japan. Japan kind of has struggled more with that, but, even they have more of a consumption-driven economy than China does. The trouble that China faces is that there is no playbook for how to make that transition to a consumption-driven economy. Nobody knows exactly how to do that. There are lots of little ideas. One of the things people have recommended that the Chinese government do is to create a stronger social safety net. The idea there being that if people have more confidence that they'll have state-provided retirement money, state-provided health care, unemployment insurance, other kinds of state benefits that we kind of take for granted in the West. If people in China are confident that they will have access to those funds when they need them, they will not feel as obligated to save as much of their money for those kinds of contingencies that those state benefits are designed to mitigate against. And so in that case, if they're saving less money, they're spending more money, and then you have more consumption. So the reasoning goes. It's sound reasoning. It's good advice. The trouble is that the Chinese government would have to provide those benefits for, 1 point billion something, 1 point and change billion people, and that's a lot. The Chinese government does not have an economy with enough per capita GDP to really make that viable, at least not yet. And so the result is that building a stronger safety net is desirable, and they have made some inroads in that direction, but for the most part, it's not really fiscally viable for the Communist Party of China at this point. But that is something that they have thought about trying to do and have made, little peripheral changes in that vein. Another thing that they could do is try to open up the Chinese economy to more foreign competition. That could lower prices a little bit and lead people to spend a little more. That could help, but obviously opening the country up to more foreign competition is complicated, right? That makes China more dependent on foreign imports, more vulnerable to foreign disruptions, and becoming more insular and isolationist is more the trend right now, in the global economy and in global trade. So it's not an attractive proposition just for that reason.
See Brexit.
Yeah, see Brexit. But also it kind of messes with a lot of public companies. China's government has shifted since Xi Jinping came to power towards a model of managing China's economy that is more focused on state-owned enterprises. That's not to say they have not made some attempts to reform them. And in some cases, they actually have opened up certain state-owned they have exposed certain state-owned enterprises to more competition. They've actually done that with automotive firms. But for the most part, the state has gotten more protective, not less, of state-owned enterprises, at least as far as foreign competition. And so that's not really happening either. So there's other ideas too. I can't remember all of them, but basically the Chinese government has been struggling to make this transition, and the current government's predisposition towards large state-owned economic actors has kind of predisposed them has kind of made them biased against making the kinds of reforms that would be necessary to create a more consumption-driven economy, in so much as those steps are broadly understood by economists. So they're kind of stuck, basically. And so long as they are, they're kind of be on this doomsday clock, where they keep pumping money into public investment in an effort to kind of prop up the economy and help, help float the economy during crises, but also to try to invest in certain key strategic sectors that are under pressure from, foreigners, again, the United States mostly. But as they do that, the more they do that, the more money they lose. In terms of opportunity cost, the money that they get back from those investments is pretty marginal. And eventually they're just going to reach a point where they can't do it anymore. And at that point, if they have not made the transition to a consumption-driven economy, they're just going to lose a major pillar of their economy, and then they're really going to start hurting. And it's not clear what happens at that point. Probably some drama. We can say that much. So there's that. All right. So those are two structural factors: demographics, and the shift to a consumption-driven economy. However you want to play the balance, the composition of the Chinese economy. Let's put it like that. So a third structural factor here. What was it? I had it on the tip of my tongue. Oh, right. Saving. Yeah, so China does not have a modern financial sector, and so there is no good, effective mechanism by which people can convert their savings into interest-generating investments. I talked before about how there's a lot of public investments, by state-owned banks and whatnot, and even by private sector banks that receive pressure from the government to lend in a certain way into certain entities. All of that means that banks are not investing as much into good return, investments that generate good returns, suboptimal investments, in other words. Because they do that, savers do not find banks to be attractive places to put their money. Generally, you can find alternative investment vehicles and firms that can get you a higher return for your savings. And even if the government were not leaning on banks to invest money in a suboptimal fashion, the number of investment firms in China is still relatively low. They're still kind of developing a modern financial sector. So, even in the existing private financial sector in China, there's not a lot of options. Not nearly as many as you would see in a country with a modern financial sector, or at least access to a modern financial sector, like you would see in the United States or Europe, or even developing countries that are more open to the global financial system. In China, they just don't have that as an option. And so the result invariably is that people put the vast majority of their savings into things like housing, which is the hottest, commodity in China as far as investments go, and generates the highest returns. And that's had very unfortunate results for the structure of the Chinese economy. Ideally, in a dynamic economy, the weight of a country's savings are invested in things like, new businesses, innovation, maybe infrastructure that is needed, stuff like that, stuff that'll get you a good return and has positive knock-on effects in the economy. But in China, they don't really yet have the ability to really direct all of those savings into productive investments. And even with the Chinese government trying to control the flows of that money, again, they try to direct it as much as possible into strategic sectors of the economy, the tech sector, for example, and also into infrastructure, and sometimes also into local government, depending. But even with that, people find ways around it. Like, the government, despite all of its power, does not have complete control over how people use their money. And so people, being clever, will actually just find ways around the financial restrictions in the economy. And a lot of that is done on the black market. We've talked before about shadow banks on here. You may recall it.
Shadow banks.
Yeah.
Yep.
So what those are is basically black market investment vehicles. Either people or a friend knows a guy who knows a guy who's investing in this project, and he wants to know if you want in on it. That kind of thing. And that's very common in China. And so investments like that end up eating up a disproportionate share of the country's money, the country's savings. So besides the fact that that results in a huge amount of the country's savings being used to just build new buildings instead of on productive innovation, on the innovative part of the economy, there's also the fact that it's all occurring outside of the regulatory space, right? It's black market activity, or maybe at best gray market activity. And so what that means then is that it's happening without significant oversight. So people get screwed over all the time, lose their money. Sometimes somebody promises to invest your money well in a project that he has some inside knowledge on, and then they'll just disappear. And then you never hear from him again. And there's nothing you can do about it, because he wasn't a bank, he wasn't a firm, he was just a guy. Mm-hmm. And you wanted to trust him, maybe because he knew a guy that you trusted, and you thought that maybe, good Guanxi would mean you were safe, but sometimes it doesn't. And then you just lose your money. So, on a small scale, that's pretty manageable. If a relatively small percentage of people are just kind of getting screwed by con men, that's manageable for the overall economy. But what happens if there's something like a shadow bank run on the banks, right? What if something happens in the black market that results in people withdrawing their money in mass, or maybe just losing their money in mass, like, say, because of some kind of property bubble popping, something like that? If that happens, the government may not have the ability to control the fallout, because, again, they can only regulate the banks that are really legal. All of these individuals and black market shadow banks and whatnot that are operating beyond the scope of the regulatory apparatus, they're not going to be able to ask for help. They'll just die, they'll just collapse, and they'll take all of those savings with them. And the government would just be helpless, hypothetically. And at that point, you could see, just trillions of dollars in people's savings disappearing, and that could have correspondingly negative impacts, not only on the economy, but also on the state's legitimacy. And of course, the Communist Party of China is very, very concerned about its legitimacy. So it has been making efforts to try to regulate shadow banks and bring more of the country's savings into the formal sector, both so it can direct it into more productive investments, but also so that it can have more oversight and control over the money in case of an emergency. but that has been an inexact science. They've been somewhat successful in that endeavor, but not fully successful. And the drama last year, actually starting in 2021, but the drama was that the real estate sector started having problems because the national government cut off real estate firms from lending because it wanted to try to lower property prices. Because of course, like everybody else on the planet, people were complaining about high property prices. Rents were too high, housing prices were too high. People couldn't buy into the market. So the government wanted to do something and decided to try to maybe not pop the bubble in the real estate sector, in so much as there even is a bubble, but maybe to at least ease it somewhat by cutting off real estate firms from lending. And the effect was pretty dramatic, because so much money, just again, the country saves something like $20 trillion, probably even more than that, in money that gets put into largely the construction sector in the form of the real estate market. And so when real estate firms got cut off from lending, that basically just threw a big giant monkey wrench into one of the largest and most important economic drivers in the country. And the result was a significant amount of disruption, right? Construction projects were halted. Investors were extremely upset because, again, people had been investing in all these little projects through shadow banks and whatnot. And it just turned into a big shit show. And eventually in 2022, the government announced that it was going to allow real estate firms to start borrowing money again. It did make efforts to try to punish actors in the real estate sector in order to try to avoid moral hazard. I think last I read, they were trying to consolidate, the worst performing actors into large corporations. Kind of a soft nationalization is how I described it when I talked about it on here. But even in spite of the strong actions they've taken, the fact that they resulted the restrictions on lending to real estate firms suggests that they've somewhat given up on this. They're not going to completely try to restructure the economy away from the real estate sector. They've recognized that that's not really possible in the short term, at least not in a way that would not have significantly disruptive effects on the health of the overall economy. So you can kind of mark that as a defeat for the party in a sense. I don't think they've fully given up, but yeah, that short-term objective of trying to ease housing prices without too much consequence definitely blew up in their face. So that's another structural flaw in China's economy, and it's one that the Communist Party of China has definitely been trying to work around over time and is trying to address, but not very successfully, at least for the moment. So those are three big fat structural factors afflicting China's economy, as requested.
Thank you.
Yeah, the temporary factors have more to do with things like inflation. Prices have been going up. China's a net energy importer. They import a lot of oil and whatnot, so the price of that has been going up. That's put pressure on them somewhat. There was a big... Oh, no, that was a couple years ago. It's the United States that has the avian flu right now, not China. But they did have some problems with things like energy transition. They had a deadline in 2021 in which they were going to try to significantly reduce dependence on electricity generated from coal plants. But a lot of provincial governments were not ready for that deadline, and the result is that you ended up with large-scale power outages in 2021. I believe it was 2021. I think we talked about it at the time when it happened. The government acted pretty quickly, so it wasn't like some long-lasting thing, but there was definitely drama there, and it was definitely not helping the economy. And of course, you may remember COVID lockdowns have been a thing in China for the past couple years. They famously ended those at the end of 2022, so that's not going to be a headwind going forward. But that had been one of the sort of temporary short-term headwinds that the economy had been struggling with. So yeah, they've had their share of issues. How did we get onto the Chinese economy?
We got to it from talking about the Xi Jinping and Putin meeting, and the ammunition and so on, and then eventually got to sanctions, and I asked if China has sanctioned the U.S., and you said
that's right. Okay.
Yeah.
So leverage over the United States. I said China doesn't want to mess with it right now because they have their own internal problems. And then you asked about internal economic problems. Okay, that's what it was. So yeah, because China is struggling with all of those domestic economic problems, as well as domestic political problems to a lesser degree in the form of, the Taiwan drama and Xi Jinping's, sort of rise to power. He was already in power, but, there was still some I's that needed to be dotted and T's that needed to be crossed in order to make it official, basically. One of the events that was in the news the past couple of weeks was the National People's Congress, and they were sort of making official some of the changes that Xi Jinping had wanted to implement and making official his third term in power.
Mm-hmm.
So the government has been more focused on that stuff, and it's not looking for drama with the United States to complicate it any further. So that's why they have not applied the sanctions that they could apply if they were otherwise inclined.
We did have a random silly question as well. Chat wants to know what your favorite kind of pizza toppings are.
All right, so here's what's up. In general, I order from Domino's.
Okay.
I used to have, sometimes I would do Pizza Hut, but then I got food poisoning a couple years ago, and I've sworn off the local Pizza Hut forever, basically. So Domino's, right? So here's what you do. You're going to get medium size, and then you're going to get it half. You're going to do toppings of one kind on one half, and then a different set of toppings on the other one. So what I like to do, this is what I do when I get the pizza. I'll have one half be basically the Wisconsin 8-cheese pizza, which is effectively just a cheese pizza, but then they also add on 4 separate cheeses. I don't know why they call it 8-cheese. I think it's feta cheese. I can't remember all of them off the top of my head, but they give you the option of adding toppings. There are 4 different extra cheeses you can add, so just add all of them, and that'll be on the right side of the pizza or the left side, whatever your preference. So that'll be one half, and then the other half I'll have it be extra garlic sauce instead of tomato sauce, and I'll do extra cheese, and then on top I'll have pepperoni with mushrooms and hamburger meat.
And you get this basically whenever you order pizza for yourself? That would be your go-to?
Yeah, that's my go-to now. That's what I've been doing.
Nice. You get the experience of 2 pizzas by getting one pizza and half one side, half the other side. Smart.
Yeah, I like a little diversity. It's
Yeah.
nice to have some different flavors.
Yeah, Chad
But I
was
don't want to get,
freaking out about pineapple on pizza. Do you have an opinion on that?
to each their own. There are people who eat anchovies on their pizza. So, whatever floats your boat. It's a free country.
Yeah.
Far be it from me to judge.
Chat, what are the ingredients on your ideal pizza? Go ahead. He reads the chat after, so he will get to enjoy this. Lasagna or spaghetti? The chat asks you.
I grew up with spaghetti, so more so that. Lasagna is pretty good, but yeah, the spaghetti with meat sauce I grew up with was very good. So I definitely generally go for that. It's also just easier to make.
There was a funny news item some chatter was excited to share with us because I know sometimes we hit silly stuff, and I have one for you this time. There is a time traveling TikTok person who makes TikTok videos, and they tell the world that they are a time traveler, and they have reported to us that the world is going to end on the 24th, which is 5 days from now, due to an alien invasion, and there will be 8,000 human survivors. So good luck to everyone with that, if it ends up being true. The Mayan calendar thing didn't end up panning out, so.
Are you sure? Are you sure, Neuro?
We're just on a slow burn, and the Mayans were right all along. It's possible.
Yeah, there was a good comment on Reddit I read about that. It was something to the effect of, people say the world didn't end in 2012, but has anything felt real since?
Yeah. I would say yes to that question, but it's fun to talk about spooky stuff.
it's been quite the wild ride internationally.
Since there are
Well,
survivors, I assume we win the war against the aliens. People in chat said that that person said the survivors were determined based on how many other people they could save. So, yeah. I think a lot of people are also curious if the aliens are hot or not, and if their COVID vaccine is going to allow them to mate with the aliens.
yeah, the internet at its finest.
Yeah. Asking the real important, hard hitting questions.
Man, you know what that makes me think of? That makes me think of V. Do you remember that?
V for Vendetta?
No, no, no. It was a TV show in the 80s. It was just called V.
Hmm. No, I
It was
haven't seen
about
that.
an alien invasion of Earth. It was actually lizard people.
Hmm.
Yeah, I remember it being pretty good. Although the last time I watched it was when I was a kid in the 90s, so, maybe I just had trash taste. Yeah, I think I did see some episodes, liked it, and I think I rented like the movie version. They cut up some of the episodes into a movie or something. I did see that and liked it. That was a long time ago. It's Agent Smith showing his age.
I've been catching up with some of the Marvel Cinematic Universe stuff with
Anything
Trisha.
good?
I saw Eternals recently. That one it's kind of disconnected from the rest of the main character storylines. So
Mm.
you don't really need to have seen all of that stuff to enjoy it. It's got cool characters with cool powers, and it's a long movie, so there's a lot of stuff to watch. So I had fun with it. And then what was the other one that I saw recently? I'm caught up with She-Hulk.
That was the
That's a TV show.
no. I how was it?
It was pretty good. It was different in that it focused a lot more so on some women's issues than many other
Mm.
shows do, which for a lot of people was a breath of fresh air. For some people, they were like, I don't see why this matters. But just like um, what it's like to try to date people. And one of the themes of the show with She-Hulk is kind of the tug of war between her Hulk persona and her human lawyer persona, and how it can be hard to find a person or even a job where people want the main real version of you, because it's like ever since she got the Hulk powers, everyone just wants Hulk all the time. So it's kind of hard for her to recalibrate herself. And the show's different too in that it's almost Deadpool like, where she breaks the fourth wall and talks to the audience a lot. So that's different as well. I thought it
Mm.
was a good show. It's got interesting heroes. There are some tie-ins too with some of the other movies. Like
Oh, of course.
there's a tie-in with I think his name is Wong. He's the
Hmm.
sorcerer guy, or whatever, in the Doctor Strange kind of set of characters. And that kind of ties in with some Shang-Chi stuff. I did see Shang-Chi. That movie is heckin' awesome. Also, apparently the actor is a gamer, and he went and he played Stormgate as well. So that's pretty cool. Same RTS that I got to try out with my partner Trisha in
Hmm.
Irvine.
Hmm.
Yeah, Shang-Chi is very good. I would say Shang-Chi, for enjoyment value, I would probably give it like above a 9 out of 10. Eternals, I would probably give like 7.5-ish. It was fun. Because it didn't connect to other stuff, you only got invested in the characters from that movie in particular. But yeah, some random movie stuff that I've been catching up with.
Yeah, I remember. Sorry.
Mandalorian started up again as well. That's a
Oh
pretty
yeah.
fun show. Some of the themes in it are like kind of tired at this point. It's like, you can't take your helmet off. You can't take your helmet off. It's like the first couple heckin' seasons are freaking out about that. I don't know how much into Star Wars you are, but the older video games of the Old Republic, they had Mandalore as a place you could go, and there were Mandalorians running around and stuff, and for them it was more about glory and battle than specifically helmet wearing. But the main character in the Mandalorian TV show is from a more radical sect of Mandalorians rather than
Hmm.
the main population.
Ah,
Yeah,
yeah, I need to watch that.
that one's
I
pretty
would,
fun.
I would probably enjoy that much more than Star Trek Discovery. I
Yeah,
ground my way through 4 seasons of that.
I have not
It
seen
wasn't,
Discovery.
it was not too bad at first, I didn't think, but and by the last season, I was really having to force myself through it. So
Hmm.
I would definitely be open to a change of pace. Yeah.
Andor is better than Mandalorian, I think, in terms of it being a unique and fresh take on the universe. It's kind of
Yeah.
weird in that it's a non-Jedi Star Wars piece.
Yeah, that's what I heard about it.
Yeah, Mandalorian still has a lot of cameos and appearances of various Jedi and stuff, so it
Well, you know,
doesn't.
Star Wars is fundamentally a war story, so they would really be better served if they told more stories like that.
Yeah.
I've always thought that's me editorializing. My favorite Star Wars book series as a kid was the X-Wing series, and that was very
Mm-hmm.
much not about the Force. That was very much about fighters and space combat and that kind of thing.
Mm.
Very different vibe from a lot of the Star Wars fare at the time. So it really pleased me when I heard about Andor that it actually turned out to be pretty good.
It's fucking super good. I think a big part of it too is the characters don't feel as one-dimensional as a lot of other, I would say, Star Wars, or really a lot of other media in general, where the character is about like one thing and they don't really change or grow at all. With Andor, it feels like you have a bunch of complex characters who they have a unique perspective on the situation and a unique vantage point that gives them things that would be predictable or unpredictable from them. Just really well written and well done. A lot of characters that you like things about them and dislike things about them, so it makes them complex and fun to watch on screen.
Yeah, pretty cool.
You've scored points with Trisha for watching Star Trek stuff. Good job.
Yeah, some of it was better than others. I think I liked Picard much more than Discovery, although I wasn't thrilled about the second season.
It's ongoing now, I think. I don't know if it's the
Yeah,
third
yeah, they
season yet.
just released the third season, I think,
Mm-hmm.
which is supposed to be the last season, if I remember correctly. Yeah, from the reviews I was reading, they kind of did with the third season what they probably should have done with the second season.
Like
So I
bringing
found
back
that.
the previous actors and stuff.
Well, partly, but I mean, I don't want to spoil anything for you. But yeah, they did some shenanigans in the second season,
Mm-hmm.
and I didn't find it necessarily as enthralling as some of the stuff they'd done in the first season. First season was more of a conventional story,
Mm-hmm.
whereas second season was kind of a mix of pandering, but also, you know, convenience shooting. They had the pandemic, so they kind of had to make some compromises, and the result was a story that was a little funky. But maybe that's just me. Yeah, I think Discovery is about to have its final season too. Yeah, I don't know if you're ever going to sit down and watch Discovery with your Trisha, right? That's her name.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I won't spoil anything for you, but yeah, that's a show that really struggled to find itself, I feel. I'll say that much.
Yeah, our family, we grew up watching the Kirk Spock Star Trek, and we didn't watch as much of the Next Generation. I think that's when Picard has his first seasons and stuff.
Yeah, yeah,
So that's probably where we'll start up watching through
yeah.
like full sets of series
See,
and
you would
stuff.
like Next Gen.
Mm-hmm.
That's like the nerd favorite. that that very much appeals to the nerd Star Trek community. So yeah, that would definitely be the first go-to recommendation.
So Zoomers would call it that one is goaded.
Oh yeah.
Oh, dude, new Zoomer phrase. It's one of my favorites now, and I don't know if you've heard this one yet, but basically, whenever Zoomers are trying to say, just let the person do their thing, they say, let him cook. So if someone's like trying to do a build order in a video game, or they're working on some like weird zany strategy or plan. Let him cook. I love it.
Hmm.
Yeah.
I'm glad you told me. That's the kind of generic phrase that would have confused the shit out of me otherwise.
They're like, I don't see him cooking at all. What's going on here?
Yeah, the older I get, the harder I find it to keep track of all the new slang.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think my sister was telling me about Riz the other day.
Riz?
Yeah,
What does
it's
that
like
mean?
a game,
Oh.
like with women, or
Uh-huh.
the opposite sex. Yeah.
Another fun one is gossip is now called tea.
What?
Gossip, like the
Hmm.
local drama of what's happening to people. They'll say, "What's the tea?" or "Are you gonna give me the tea?" But
Where are
you
they
don't
getting
actually.
this stuff?
Dude, they just make this shit up. Chat saying that Riz is short for charisma.
There you go.
Ah. What are some other good Zoomer ones that we're trying to learn? Oh yeah, a really silly one. Get this guy some milk. That means like they need help. Who is in a situation where you need help and you say, get him some milk? Like he's stuck on the side of the road and his car's broken down. It's like, well, at least he has a glass of milk. Could be worse. Zoomerisms, you know. Okay, well, we could get stuck on that indefinitely, so I do want to mention some other stuff that people have asked so far. There was one that was asking about the UBS purchase of Bank Suisse.
Yeah, that was part of the fallout from SV Bank collapsing.
Mm.
Yeah, there has been some contagion. But for the most part, it's been pretty well contained. Generally, it's the banks that had riskier portfolios, rather, that have been getting hit. So that's pretty much what you would expect and really what should happen. So
Mm-hmm.
it's not creating too many, it's not creating waves that have been too big to really threaten the broader economy, at least not yet.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, what was it? Credit Suisse is, I think it's a Swiss bank, if I'm not mistaken. The name certainly sounds Swiss to me.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, yeah, they'd kind of been on shaky ground for a while. Credit Suisse has been struggling for some years now, so it's not a big surprise that they kind of got caught out here. So what UBS did is that they kind of answered the call from the Swiss central bank to come out and try to help out Credit Suisse. They could let the bank just collapse, but they don't want to do that because they want to try to contain the damage. But they also don't want to just bail them out, directly. The central bank itself does not want to have to do that, so that it doesn't cause moral hazard.
Mm-hmm.
So what they did is they tried to kind of find a buyer that could come in and buy Credit Suisse on the cheap, try to cover all of the depositors and their money there. So UBS was willing to do that. I was reading on Twitter that they had for a while a clause that would actually void the agreement if what was it, credit default swaps for Credit Suisse rose by more than 100 basis points, which Twitter thought was a little interesting. They thought that was they thought that was kind of a sabotage on the part of UBS. They were saying that that kind of agreement is guaranteed to be activated, and that was UBS's way of trying to get out of the agreement. But then I also read later on that UBS removed that from the agreement, so apparently that's no longer in effect. So Credit Suisse, nominally, last I checked, was doing okay. They're going to have to unwind the bank most likely, but the bank probably will not implode in the short term. It's going to be a managed decline here, probably under the tutelage of UBS. I would point out again what I said last time on here, which is that I do not have a background in finance. So when I talk about this stuff, it's very much secondhand knowledge from articles, analysts on Twitter and other places. This is not my educational background.
Yeah, and we're also not scared of being told that we're wrong about something, especially if you're an expert in a field. So feel free to drop a message in the chat summarizing what we messed up or leave us a scathing review in the YouTube comments and we'll be sure to try to do any corrections if we got stuff wrong.
Yeah, we've gotten some good comment. I noticed last time we had some really good comments from people who are more familiar with the financial system. So I definitely appreciated reading those comments and getting that feedback. Very informative. I can't always make sense out of it, but it gives me a start. Gives me something to work with. Yeah, we had a guy on here. What was he saying? Let me see if I can find it. SV Bank. Yeah, 300 Beezus. He was a guy in chat last time, and he was saying that typical banks lend against accounts receivable, I think it was, AR, and that VC, venture capital firms, would suggest SV Bank lend against a longer form of earning stream, typically annual contracted revenue. So I recognize some of those words, but some elaboration would be appreciated. Not quite my wheelhouse. I'm not sure what he means by lending against longer forms of earning stream.
Agent Smith's response, thanks. What? And then there was a general question of asking about an update. I guess that kind of ties in with the Silicon Valley Bank collapse update. Has anything else happened aside from this acquisition?
Here in the United States, we had a bank called First Republic almost fail. But then there was a consortium of banks that got together and gave them, well, not give per se, but transferred, infused, if you like, $11 billion into First Republic Bank. Last I checked, depositors were still fleeing the bank, so that may not be enough to save them, but it's at least bought them some time. Oh yeah, Credit Suisse got $50 billion from the Swiss Central Bank. That was before UBS came in. So the central bank did give them some money to try to prevent them from collapsing. But it wasn't meant to completely bail them out, which is why UBS was brought in. There actually was a bank that collapsed like just before we talked last time.
Mm-hmm.
It was what was Signature Bank. I actually wasn't aware of that when we were talking last time, but that had actually just collapsed just recently before we'd started up our last segment last week. And I haven't read as much about that, but basically from what I read, the CEO was saying that it was just fallout from SV Bank. He was saying that there had already been people withdrawing some money because they were pretty deep into stuff like crypto and whatnot. Or wait, no, not crypto. That's a different bank. But yeah, they'd already been getting some contagion because people were moving money out of SV Bank. And then when SV Bank had its run, when there was a run on the bank, Signature got hit hard. And so they ended up collapsing as well. But I haven't read as much about the structure of Signature Bank, what their business model was, etc. They've kind of flown under the radar. Most of the attention has been on SV Bank because it was so much bigger.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Signature had, what was it? What I have in my notes here is that it had 40 branches, $110.36 billion in assets, and deposits of $88.59 billion at the end of 2022. So it's a decent sized bank, but it's not like SV Bank size. It's a bit smaller than that. So there hasn't been nearly as much drama over its collapse. And so much as there's something to be worried about there, it was the possibility of contagion, but that was pretty well contained. There's another bank called Silvergate, which is being wound down. It's not collapsing, but it's basically, what is it? I think it's in the process of declaring bankruptcy or something like that. They had a bunch of their assets in crypto stuff. And so that's why they're basically failing. The crypto market really took a bad hit over the past 6 months. So banks that were disproportionately exposed to the crypto market have really been hurting. And so Silver Bank here has been one such bank, but the SV Bank collapse has hit them pretty hard. They were already on shaky legs, but now they're actively just winding up operations. I did read that Silvergate's problems and the fact that they were struggling was one of the reasons that people were withdrawing money out of SB Bank. One of the reasons that confidence had been shaken in SV Bank, if not also Signature Bank. So that is one of the variables that was in play there in the lead up to the bank run. Yeah, again, these are banks that lend in relatively risky parts of the economy. So, these are exactly the kinds of banks that you would expect to struggle after something dramatic like a collapse in the crypto market or consistent interest rate hikes. And again, it's not a bad thing inherently that they fail. Banks that take risks should fail if, things don't go their way. That's
Well,
how the
you're
system is
saying
supposed to
high
work.
risk plays don't always work?
Correct.
Ooh, that's a tricky one. I'll have to watch out for that.
Well, the Fed has done a pretty good job of avoiding moral hazard thus far. So the shareholders are going to get wiped for the most part. There's some concern about moral hazard with depositors, but that's more of an abstract argument. Basically, if depositors were not supposed to have all of their money insured, but one of the things the Federal Reserve did is announce that they were going to cover all of the depositors' money anyway, despite the fact that the FDIC did not cover all of it. And they kind of had different little tricks that they used in order to make that happen. They're going to raise premiums on banking insurance in order to try to make up for the money that they're going to lose on this. And they're also going to use what they're calling a bank term funding program, which is this new tool, which basically just allows them to give short-term loans, well, a short-term loan to a bank that is hurting for liquidity in the hope that it'll either stabilize the bank or at least buy time. Yeah, some people were arguing about whether or not that was a kind of soft bailout on Twitter. But I think overall it makes sense. It's a solid program. I don't think they're bullshitting with it. But that was one of the things that they wanted to do there to try to ease that crisis. Successfully so, it seems. Sometimes my train of thought just wanders off, and I don't know where it goes.
That's fine. It's always interesting, good content. And if it's wrong, then people in the chat are also fired up. Other stuff that people asked about, someone was curious about the relationship between Germany and America, and they said that they are German and the country is pretty split on whether they think that they have a good relationship with us or a not so good relationship with us.
Yeah, that's a pretty good question. The history of German-American relations is somewhat fraught, shall we say? Obviously, there was significant drama in the early 20th century. You can probably guess why.
Mm-hmm.
But even after that, relations were sometimes shaky. Yeah, they'd been rivals for so long that even during the Cold War, there was some residual resentment there.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of what really tied the Allies together during the Cold War, or what I should say NATO, what tied NATO together during the Cold War was just a common concern over communism, right? Specifically the Soviet Union. And that kind of covered up differences. But in West Germany, for probably the first 20 years or so, after World War II, the United States and Germany kind of played a weird little game, right? So the game was that the United States needed West Germany, such as it was. We didn't immediately make the western half of Germany an independent state. It started out as just occupation zones, and then just kind of through historical serendipity, we ended up merging them together. That's a whole story unto itself. I'm grossly simplifying there, but basically that's how West Germany was formed. But regardless, we wanted Western Germany to be strong and economically viable. And that was kind of in contravention of some of the plans and even promises that the United States had made before the war ended. But as we ran into increasing problems with the Soviets as far as negotiating a settlement on how to unify Germany, as well as perceived duplicity on the part of the Soviets, it became increasingly apparent that unification probably wasn't going to happen, and that Western Germany was going to be a bulwark against Soviet communism in Western Europe. So we wanted them to be strong, or at least stable. And that was a problem because a lot of people in West Germany after World War II still had ties to the Nazi Party, right? We did not do like a full purge of Germany after World War II. To a degree, it just wasn't viable. Like, if you live in an authoritarian country, generally what happens is that if you want a good job, you have to be affiliated with the dominant political power in some way. Like in Saddam Hussein's Iraq, Iraq, however you want to pronounce it, you had to be a member of the Ba'athist Party in order to have a career of any substance, or at least with any possibility of progression. So not really any different in the Nazi Party in a lot of ways. That's not to say everybody who joined the Nazi, that's not to say that the Nazi Party did not have a lot of people that were firm believers, or that most of the people that joined it were just people joining opportunistically. There definitely were mostly ideologues, but there were a lot of people who were educated, who just kind of had to join because that was the convenient thing to do. And so that kind of put us in an awkward place after the war. When we were planning on deindustrializing Germany and, kind of reducing them to a rural agrarian society, it didn't matter so much. We didn't need skilled labor out of the Germans. And so we just kind of ignored them. But when we decided that we needed to build up Germany, then we had to find skilled labor in Germany, and a lot of that skilled labor, and certainly a lot of the experienced politicians, had ties to the party to one degree or another. Now, again, that's not to say that everybody in post-war Germany was like a former Nazi of some kind. There were like left-wingers, who had ties with the SPD before the war. There were socialists, to a lesser degree communists. Communism did not have a great reputation at that point for obvious reasons, but they were there as well. So there was a diversity of political opinions there. But even so, just because there were a significant number of people who had ties with the party, and because the United States could not really afford to just purge them or alienate them, because that would have jeopardized the project to rebuild Germany's economy, as well as its government, we ended up allowing a lot of people with suspect pasts back into German society. And so that was the game that we played, right? We were trying to rebuild Germany, but we had to do it by allowing people who were suspect to kind of come back into society. And that had kind of different effects in Germany itself. For one, people who were former Nazis or had been part of the Nazi Party generally were not fond of the United States. They didn't like being invaded and conquered. They didn't particularly like liberalism in general. They liked that the United States was going to help defend them against the communists. That was sort of the unifying factor there. But that didn't mean that they didn't harbor significant residual resentment against the United States on account of, the war, the biggest war in human history. The other big effect it had was delayed, and you would have to wait until the 1960s to see this. But what happened is that a whole generation of German children grew up in what turned out to be a pretty successful Germany, a pretty successful iteration of Germany, if you like, West Germany in the 1950s and 60s. And so, good society, people get educated, and then the kids start kind of learning about the history, especially in college. And what they find is that, there's a surprisingly large number of former Nazis that are still kind of hanging around, and that Germany had not really fully reckoned with the war at that point. Today we think of Germany as having really atoned for its past and making significant strides in that vein over the past 50 years. But that was not really the case in the first 20 years after World War II. That first 20 years saw a lot more of a mixed approach to dealing with the war. This is where you see things like the myth of the good Wehrmacht kind of come out, and a lot of other sort of what the kids would call today copes. We were talking about Zoomer slang. So there were little cultural copes in Germany
Like
for the first
copium?
20 years. Like copium, yeah.
Oh, gotcha, gotcha. Copium. Mm.
So in the 1960s, there was a big, cultural revolution all over the West. The United States in particular was kind of the epicenter for that. We had all the hippies and, the experimentation with drugs and free love and all that sort of thing. But that was a phenomena all over the Western world. You could see that everywhere. Germany was no exception. And as part of that cultural, zeitgeist, people and, well, kids, again, younger folks in Germany really started to question the country's past, the country's reckoning with the war and how it had handled itself in the post-war period. And there was a lot of consternation and angst, in particular towards the United States, in so much as it had de facto allied itself and modern Germany with some of these people who probably, arguably, should have been punished significantly more substantively than they were in the wake of World War II, which again saw lots of atrocities. And that period, too, of 60s radicalism also just saw a lot of generic sort of left-wing politics really come to the fore in Germany. It had always been there, but it really came out in the 1960s and became a dominant strand. And that strand of left-wing politics in Germany had always been very skeptical of the United States, not necessarily as a country per se, but America as a kind of avatar of capitalism, which, we've kind of always been to varying degrees. And of course, leftists don't like capitalism, especially American style Wild West capitalism, as they frame it in Germany.
If you get ripped off, it was your fault.
Yeah, that's
American capitalism.
So that's always really been unpopular in Germany, but especially with the left. And as they kind of came to the fore in the 1960s, the United States kind of became a boogeyman. So they didn't hate the United States per se, but they didn't trust it either. There was a kind of lingering perception in German politics that the United States was an ambitious imperialist power that wanted to make Germany a kind of puppet state, or at least a proxy state, and that it wanted to use Germany's market for its own benefit as a kind of outpost of the American imperium. So for economic purposes and strategic purposes as a bulwark against Soviet communism. And that manifested politically into Willy Brandt's term in power. His whole thing was Ostpolitik, a kind of sort of more chill détente approach to East Germany in particular, but also the Soviet Union. And that style of politics ended up becoming dominant in German foreign policy up until 2022, when there was some drama that kind of reversed that. That was the Zeitenwand. Zeitenwand or Wand, I don't remember. Zeitenwand, I think it's pronounced, as they call it. But anyway, that sort of approach, being more friendly with the Soviets and being skeptical of the United States really came out of German politics in the 1960s. Again, it had always been there, but 60s radicalism turbocharged it. And there's been that strand of anti-Americanism in German politics ever since. So that's not to say that there are not Atlanticists in German politics. There definitely are, but they're really more foreign policy Atlanticists. Beyond foreign policy, the relationship kind of ends, right? They're not interested in emulating American capitalism or American public policy. They just prefer to ally with the United States as a like-minded, friendly country, but not necessarily one that they're especially close to. It's a strategic friendship that has a strategic basis, and there is some genuine friendship there in so much as there's cultural affinity, but it's not nearly as close as, say, the American relationship with the United Kingdom, or really even the American relationship with France in a lot of ways. We kind of started today by talking a little bit about that. The United States and France have a lot in common. For all of the fighting and bickering that we do, we're actually generally on the same page, at least in terms of the big picture, right? Broad-based strategy. And we frequently cooperate on that count. Germany has been much, much more reluctant about cooperating with the United States on security matters outside of Europe, and even in Europe, Germany has been very reluctant to significantly invest in its own defense after the Cold War. Definitely willing during the Cold War. But even then, there was skepticism about the United States, as manifested by Ostpolitik, which I mentioned earlier. Yeah, during the Cold War, West Germany had the largest, I think it had the largest army in NATO, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, the Bundeswehr was quite the beast at that time. Fallen off significantly since then. But
Cool.
that's sort of where that tension between German political culture and, well, not German political culture per se, but German political zeitgeist, let's put it like that. That tension between the zeitgeist in Germany and relations with America, that kind of stems from the post war period
Mm-hmm.
and some of the compromises Washington made in the immediate post war period, and then later on, the impact of 60s radicalism on German politics, which turbocharged pre existing anti American feeling in the country. And, things like Vietnam didn't help. That was very much seen as unnecessary, violently unnecessary by many in Germany. And the non-proliferation movement in the early 80s also turned a lot of Germans off of the United States. Long story short, the Soviets started developing intermediate range ballistic missiles, putting them in Europe in order to try to intimidate European states. And the United States responded by deploying into Europe nuclear-equipped cruise missiles, which was a relatively new technology at the time. But the fact that the United States was deploying those missiles in Europe was hugely controversial in Europe, because in Europe it was seen as an escalation on the part of Washington. And there was a sense that Washington was basically gambling with other countries' fates. By putting nuclear weapons in these countries, the United States was making them a target in the event of World War III, since obviously the Soviets would attack those sites,
Mm-hmm.
possibly with nuclear weapons. And so a lot of anti-war people and non-proliferation activists really came out pretty hard against the United States correspondingly. I would point out again that there was a divide between publics and governments in this regard. The public was much more skeptical of it than governments were. Governments pretended to be skeptical, but by and large, they were willing to kind of let it go, if not actually subtly encourage it. Governments do sneaky shit like that a lot. They'll say they're against things when they're actually for them, and then secretly encourage them.
Mm-hmm.
The United States has definitely been penalized by that multiple times over the course of the past couple decades, if not half century. Not to say we haven't done bad things, but sometimes we have had to play the bad cop in order to make partner governments be the good cop
Mm-hmm.
for political reasons.
Probably because we're less vulnerable to pressure, like we were talking about before, with regard to China.
Well, we're less vulnerable to pressure, but also, we want partner governments to assist us with certain things, or at least not to oppose them.
Mm-hmm.
Like, say, the deployment of nuclear weapons in the early 1980s.
Mm-hmm.
And so we recognize that partner governments are under pressure. And so we'll try to play like we're maybe putting pressure on them, maybe leaning on them a little bit in order to give them the political room to maneuver.
Right.
You know, they don't have to come out and say they actively support the United States. They can come out and make the excuse that the United States is pressuring them or otherwise conditioning this, that, or the other benefit on their support. And so that they're going to do it for that reason, not because they actually support it, when in fact, maybe they actually do support it, but just can't say so because it would be unpopular. So we do partner governments the favor of allowing them to get away with that, even though it actually does result in a hit to the reputation of the United States within the country's politics.
Mm-hmm.
Now, again, I would reiterate, it's not as though the United States has not actually pressured countries into doing things that they haven't wanted to do. We have. But I'm saying that some of the resentment against the United States and countries is not completely a function of that. It's also a function of this little political game that we've played in international diplomacy. But I would certainly welcome feedback from any Germans listening. I'm sure they would know much more about it than I would. And I think we've got some, probably. I guess I
Yeah,
could look at the flags.
that's usually one of the higher viewership EU countries for StarCraft streams for sure. And there's nice streamability, I would guess, because basically all Germans speak English. Actually, for
Sorry.
German people, what do you think is the percentage of people who speak English? Feels
Probably
like,
pretty high.
yeah, feels like it's 95 plus. Not really. I guess I wouldn't know the Germans who don't speak English, because the ones who do speak English are the ones who talk on my chat.
So I'm looking at the flags, and I noticed somebody in chat just over here. They're from Texas, but they identify as German. So I would ask if they're from the German Hill Country, which, yes, is a thing in Texas. Yeah, we've got 4 people. Well, we've got 4 people who Twitch says are from Germany. Maybe that's just the VPN screwing with me again.
Mm-hmm.
We've actually got somebody from Greenland on here.
Oh.
So I would ask, do we actually have anybody from Greenland watching, or is this another VPN thing? Because I'm pretty sure we've never had a Greenlander on here. I think this is the first time I've seen their flag. What else did we have? Well, hopefully that's a decent answer to the question about Germany and the United States. It's kind of a meandering answer all over the place, but I think that hit kind of the principal beats. If I ever don't answer somebody's question to their satisfaction, they're more than welcome to ask again. I don't always get the questions. I don't always get the gist of the questions right at the first go.
Oh, we do have someone from Greenland.
Oh, that's pretty cool. Let's see. What else did we was there anything else in particular we wanted to get to?
Yeah, I think I had a couple other questions. Let me check. There was a Skittles ban is what they called it, but I think there's a proposition to ban some ingredients that are in Skittles and some other stuff people were curious about. I don't know if you saw anything about that.
I have not. My tracking of Skittles developments is woefully low.
He's
So
not
I'm
a
afraid I'm a
Skittles
little...
expert. Ask someone
No,
else.
I'm afraid not. So I can't comment too much on it. My condolences to all of the Skittles eaters out there.
Yeah, we did talk about the Putin and Xi Jinping meeting. We did not talk about Putin visiting Crimea, which someone just asking about now.
I don't think it was Crimea. It was actually Mariupol.
Oh.
That's what I was reading. Maybe he's gone to Crimea since then, but what I was reading today is that he made a surprise visit to Mariupol, which is in southeastern Ukraine. That was the big city that fought for like, what was it, like a month or two? It was under siege for a long time because because the Ukrainian soldiers kept on fighting in the steel works, as I recall. So Putin showed up there. The Ukrainian government didn't like it. Not much they could do about it, though. Yeah, mostly just done for propaganda. Just kind of showing up, thumbing his nose at the West and the Ukrainian government. It's also probably an indirect response to Biden showing up at Kiev. That was kind of a snub in and of itself. So this is Putin's response, basically. But I don't think it has much significance beyond that. Unless he does something dramatic while he's there anyway.
And then there was one, I think it's a proposition currently for reparations for African Americans in San Francisco. I saw that it was proposed, and then there are people talking about it. It hasn't gone through yet, but this would be, I think, the first of its kind. And I'm not sure the scale of it because it was for the city of San Francisco, so I don't think it would be a statewide, like, Californian thing.
Yeah. Yeah, this might need some elaboration for those of you listening who are not from the United States. I think pretty much almost all of the people listening are American, like just heavily, the significant majority. What is it? Yeah, 79. So, but for the benefit of those of you who are not, we have this debate in American politics about what are called reparations. So, I think everybody, even people outside the US, are familiar with the fact that the United States had slaves for a long time. Slavery was legal here. People of African descent, well, Africans specifically at first were brought over as slaves, and then their descendants were also enslaved up until the 1860s. And so since then, there's been an on again, off again debate in American politics, more so from the second half of the 20th century, about whether or not the federal government should give payments to people who are descended from slaves as a form of reparations, basically a way of trying to make amends for slavery, if not also just racism generally. And, the idea there is that because of slavery and also because of structural racist policies within the design of laws and within American politics generally, that African Americans today can attribute some of the not everybody who's African American is in poverty, but relatively speaking, African Americans are not as well off as other ethnic groups, despite having been here for hundreds of years. So some of that could be attributed to the legacy of slavery, while most of it, I think, is generally attributed to the legacy of slavery and to institutional racism. So that being the case, should we not give them some money in order to help them make up that lost ground and give them some more favorable access to resources by which they could improve their condition and maybe come closer to the socioeconomic status, or maybe more specifically financial footing that they would have had if not for discriminatory policies like slavery and other, forms of racist policy making like Jim Crow laws, redlining, etc.
Mm.
So that's a rough review of the debate, And again, that's more of a modern thing. It's not something people really talked about much in like the 19th century or early 20th century. The country was still like very, very racist, much more so than today. So that it wasn't really viable at that time. But, more in the late second half of the 20th century, especially in the 1960s, there was a lot more talk about that. And it's never really gone anywhere. And sometimes it disappears from the public discourse. But in times where race relations kind of come to the fore in American politics, reparations and talk thereof generally comes back to some degree. And so it's been talked about more since 2020 on account of the George Floyd protests and the subsequent quote unquote reckoning of race that emerged after that. I don't really think it was an actual reckoning of race. There hasn't been much that's really substantively changed, but it was something that people pushed very, very hard after, well, during and after 2020. And so there's been renewed interest. So there's been a couple localities, not the federal government. It's never going to happen at the federal level. Spoiler alert, there's never going to be enough consensus about that. There's a lot of people in the United States, especially on the political right, that hate just giving people money. So, slavery is no exception to that. They're just going to oppose it on principle, basically. So that most likely means there's never going to be sufficient political support at the federal level to make this happen. But people will still argue about it for sure. Even at the state level, generally, there's not enough support to do it in any significant way. But at the local level, there have been some places that have actually tried to do it. There's been more talk than action, but more recently, in the past couple of years, there was actually a suburb of Chicago. I think it was like Evansville, Evanstown, something like that. They actually decided to implement a policy of reparations. I don't think it was cash payments per se. I think they were just going to try to find African Americans in the community who owned homes and give them payments to help them pay for the maintenance and repair of those homes. And they would do that, I don't know, for like 20 years or whatever. They were going to do it in maybe even in perpetuity. But the idea there was to try to give them some financial compensation that would go towards reparations over a long period of time. More recently, and what this question or was thinking of was the proposal in San Francisco to do something similar to what was being done over near Chicago. And, like you mentioned, it hasn't been passed yet, but they're talking about it. So, it's no surprise that these actions are being taken in areas of the country which are already very, very left oriented, right? Chicago is known for left-wing politics, probably more so left-wing machine politics than progressive politics, but nonetheless, it's still left-wing politics. And San Francisco in particular is known for being very, very progressive. So, I would note that you generally don't see proposals like this gain a lot of traction, certainly not actually implemented in most cities, even in northern cities that are normally associated more with the Democratic Party. So this is not likely something you're going to see a lot of going forward. Again, there's too much opposition, even among relatively moderate people. Uh, but, that said, it is a nice gesture. And, if I had to guess, I would say San Francisco would probably go through with it. They're kind of having some of a backlash in San Francisco politics to progressive politics, but that's more in the sort of the law and order sphere of politics. I think in general, as far as like race relations, they're still very, very progressive. So there's a very good chance that they'll follow through with this. I don't know how much money they'll really spend on it, or how much they even really can spend on it, because it's still just a city. It's a very wealthy city, but you know their budget has limitations. So I'm not sure just how much they can really afford to actually give people. It's worth noting that San Francisco does not have a very large African American population. They do
Yeah, I
have,
think
I
the
think,
article that I saw was 6%.
yeah, that's not much. So even if they don't spend a lot of money on it, it might go a long way for the few who actually get it.
Mm.
But it's also worth noting that the west coast of the United States has never been a place that had a lot of slaves historically. Really, we'd only just started colonizing it like 20 years before the Civil War. I mean, there had been people living there before that, but like the big wave of migrants that came in and populated California during the gold rush didn't start until what, the 1850s? Or no, 48. Right. No, 49. San Francisco 49ers, so it must have been 1849. Yeah, so late 1840s roughly. So yeah, that was what, 50, oh, it's 10 years, even less than that, right? So that's like 10, just a little over 10 years before the American Civil War started. So it was never really a place that had a lot of slaves. When California became a state, it became a free state and it actually banned slavery. So the results, well, that's partly the reason why there's not a lot of African Americans out of California. It also was because there was a lot of places, the local and county level, if not also the state level. I'm not as familiar with like state politics in California, but almost certainly at the local and county level, a lot of places in the western United States, including California, actually banned African Americans from moving there. And that's actually a big part of the reason why, even after slavery ended, there was not a whole lot of movement of African Americans out of the South into the American West. And again, that's part of the reason why the American West is disproportionately white relative to the rest of the country.
Hmm. Didn't know that. I did know that
Yeah,
Oregon had some laws like that, where Oregon was like, I think one of those secretly racist states, and that they had a bunch of barriers for people of color to live there, but there weren't any people of color there, so you wouldn't really see like active physical in-person racism because it was just a homogenous demographic.
yeah. No, I would not say that they were secretly racist at the time. At the time, they were very open about it.
Oh.
They were not subtle about it
Well, I guess
at all.
secretly in the sense that it wasn't something that I was taught in school.
There you go. There you go. Yeah, no, even before the Civil War, they actually had laws in place that forbid people from taking their slaves with them because they wanted the Pacific Northwest to be white. They wanted it to be a readout of European settlement. Uh, some of that was because of the debate over free labor and slave labor. They didn't want slaves coming and undermining the market for free labor. So, there was some good intention in that sense, but also they didn't want people they considered inferior coming up. They wanted it to be ethnically homogenous, like you mentioned. And even after slaves were banned, to reiterate, they continued to prevent people who were African American from moving up. And they still wanted to like maintain that ethnic homogeneity objective. They were pretty successful in that. I don't think a significant number of African Americans moved up to the Pacific Northwest until like around World War One, when they started looking for factory workers to work in like Seattle and other urban areas. And even after that, it wasn't like a big part of the population. And I think it's still like, what, 90% white? Is that what it is?
In Oregon?
Yeah, like Pacific Northwest broadly.
I wouldn't say 90% because we have a very high Latino population and pretty high
Ah,
Asian population. I think higher than southern states by quite a lot. Maybe not
okay.
higher Latino population, but higher Asian population. But yeah, definitely lower African American population in the Pacific Northwest than in the South.
Gotcha. But yeah, that was sort of the genesis of the Pacific Northwest as an ethnically homogenous region of the United States. It's also worth mentioning too, and you obviously already know this, Neuro, but again, for the people out from not people not from the United States, for those people listening right now, you can divide the Pacific Northwest in two. The part of the Pacific Northwest that's west of the mountains, the coastal region, very liberal, more urban. Well, I should say more progressive. Liberal has a different meaning. Uh, East of those mountains, it's more rural and very conservative. Eastern Washington and Eastern Oregon have more in common with places like Idaho and Wyoming than with the West Coast of Oregon and Washington.
Yeah, they want to break off and be their own state.
You heard about that, huh?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think isn't it that they want to join Idaho?
Yes. Because Idaho's conservative and Eastern Washington is conservative, and they're both more Christian. Western Washington is very progressive, so it's more kind of like California vibe, politically
Mm,
speaking. Eastern Washington, lower population density, more rural overall, just a lot more land per person. Yeah,
yeah.
Cascadia is what they want to call it.
Yeah, I read that book, American Nations, a while back. I think I talked about it a little bit. One of the things that the author brought up is that the west coast of the Pacific Northwest was settled more by people from the northeastern United States, especially like the people who had been descended from Puritans and whatnot.
Mm-hmm.
So, more the English population, basically. And the rural interior of the Pacific Northwest was settled more by Scots-Irish peoples,
Mm.
specifically from like the Appalachias, Kentucky, Tennessee, sort of that area. And so that's part of the reason why that cultural divide exists. It's not just urban rural. Partly it also has to do with the pattern of settlement, so to speak. Because Scots-Irish descended peoples in the United States, and even in communities that were founded by Scots-Irish, but which are no longer Scots-Irish, those areas are almost invariably conservative,
Mm.
very conservative. That distinctive Scots-Irish culture very much influences political preferences to this day. Yeah, that was a pretty cool book. The book's argumentation kind of broke down the further into American history it got, but like the first 150 some years of well, 200 years, the first 200 years of American history they talked about. His argument about patterns of settlement kind of bore up. It's pretty interesting.
What'd you say the name of the book was?
I think it was American Nations. Yeah,
A History
American
of 11
Nation.
Rival.
Yeah, that's the one.
Okay, nice.
Yeah, pretty fun little read. That was where I learned about the Scots-Irish tribes in the Appalachians banding together and laying siege to Philadelphia.
What?
Yeah, that was a wild one. I'd never heard about that. That was a cool story.
That's funny.
yeah, I don't remember quite what the genesis of it was, but they were upset about the colonial government, some dispute about something. I think it was over Native Americans,
Mm.
because the Pennsylvania government was very, well, it was pretty friendly to the native peoples. They wanted peace. Because a lot of the founders of Pennsylvania were actually pacifists. Specifically, they were Quakers, who were well known in American history for being pacifists. So, they wanted peaceful relations. They didn't want to like go to war or anything like that. They just wanted everybody to kind of get along. And their trouble is that the Quakers, as well as the Germans that principally settled Pennsylvania, were mostly focused in the southeast of the country, on the most fertile flat territories, in and around, Delaware and I don't know what the river is that runs through Philadelphia, but sort of that area. But the interior of Pennsylvania was much more hilly, rugged, and mountainous. And most of the people that settled there were Scots-Irish. And a lot of them like came right over from Northern Ireland, which was not like having a good time at that point of history. I'm talking about like late 1600s here. So this is pretty early on in colonial American history. And so, a lot of these dudes were like very rough hewn. They were used to living in a very restive region. Northern Ireland was pretty violent at that time. And when they came over and started settling out on the frontier, they were very frequently in conflict with Native American tribes. And they very much did not appreciate the colonial government trying to make peace with them. They wanted the colonial government to back them up. So at one point, they kind of got really frustrated and finally said, you know what, fuck it, we're just going to go and make them change their policy. And so they formed this big army of like tribal hills people, and they just marched on Philadelphia. You know what it was? It wasn't political at that point. They were actually chasing some natives. There was like a specific group of Native Americans that they'd gotten in a dispute with, and they had run off to Philadelphia, basically seeking sanctuary. And so then the Scots-Irish peoples there, they formed a big army, and they went to Philadelphia and demanded that they hand over the Native Americans in the city. And there was a big standoff that lasted something like a couple weeks
Hmm.
before they were able to negotiate a settlement.
I've never heard this story. It's bound to be all kinds of interesting stuff that happened in the early settling time. Record keeping wasn't quite as good back then either, so not all
Well,
of it would have.
especially for the Scots-Irish, because they were living in some of like the worst territory, so it was much harder for them to scrape by.
Mm-hmm.
And so the result is that they were not nearly as wealthy as the other parts of the colonies, and wealthier people are generally better at recording. They're recording their lives, writing books, getting educated, and learning how to read and whatnot, such that they can have like a diary or, write something, some kind of record down that we can kind of gauge their experience by. Because the Scots-Irish were much poorer by comparison, we don't have as many primary sources among them.
Mm-hmm.
And so our history of colonial America is disproportionately urban and cosmopolitan in outlook and coastal in outlook, as opposed to the sort of more rough-hewn interior experience of the Scots-Irish. They were not really a part of that same world that the coastal population was in. And so it's very much an undersung part of colonial history as a result. The book I mentioned kind of delves into that. Like, especially during the Revolutionary War, there was like a whole other aspect of the war that I really don't remember being taught much in school, which was basically the aspect of the Revolutionary War as a civil war. So the Scots-Irish peoples, in the Appalachians, they were not uniformly for or against the revolution. The author in the book makes the case that rather Scots-Irish groups in different parts of the country allied with either the Continental Army or the British, depending on local political disputes. In some territories, the Scots-Irish were very much on bad terms with the powers that be, and so they would actually, if the powers that be were pro-British, they would ally with the Continentals, or if the powers that be were pro-independence, then they would actually ally with the British. So for them, it was independence and freedom was not as important as fighting their enemies in the colonies.
Mm.
And so in that sense, it was much more of a civil war in this sort of principled war, principled revolution, against the British, at least for this particular group in the colonies. That was much more a feature of fighting in the southern United States, as I recall. I think the Scots-Irish in Pennsylvania managed to hash out a kind of understanding with the state government during the war. But in places like Virginia, North Carolina, there was an extreme amount of violence in the backcountry. In the coastal areas, it was more like army versus army. The Continental Army got the worst of that, so by and large, the British were able to occupy most of the ports there. But whenever the British moved into the interior, they would fight basically a guerrilla war. They would basically have a guerrilla war fought against them by Scots-Irish peoples, if those Scots-Irish peoples were principally against the coastal elite. Sometimes, again, they would actually ally with the British if the coastal elite were pro-independence. And in those cases, the British would actually form loyalist armies out of the Scots-Irish. And in those cases, what would happen is that those loyalist Scots-Irish armies would end up fighting against pro-independent Scots-Irish armies, since they generally filled out the armies for the most part. Coastal populations either weren't large enough or were not sufficiently inclined to go out and fight. And so you ended up with a kind of tribal Scots-Irish Highland War in the backcountry in the south against these rival Scots-Irish factions. And from what I was reading, it was really cutthroat. Like from the description I read, like the backcountry in the rural South, after the Revolutionary War ended, had absolutely been devastated by the fighting. And it wasn't the British. It was mostly just fighting between different groups of Americans.
Interesting.
Yeah, pretty wild stuff. Yeah, we still need to organize that thing with
Eche
Fatum. Yeah. Keep forgetting about that. We've got that. We even opened up a channel here in Discord for it.
Yeah. Yeah, he's been busy getting ready for fatherhood.
Oh yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's probably going to tie him down for a while.
Yeah.
Probably the next 20 years or so. I hope he's doing well. I saw you guys did a thing the other day.
Yeah, we did the philosophy of love, and it was the historical interpretations of the different kinds of love, and then a more modern set of takes on it. Pretty cool stuff. Yeah, he's a very interesting guy. Never had to collaborate with someone and then say they couldn't make it because of their horse having a problem, but he missed one of the episodes because of his horse.
I hope the horse is doing okay.
Yeah.
My grandmother would want me to inquire. She's a big horse person.
Mm-hmm.
Always take care of your animals, she always says.
Yeah, I like that. Yeah, he's also pretty big into outdoorsy activities too. He had one of those like helmet camera things, and there was a video of him like getting stuck on a rock and then like front flipping over and crashing on his bike. He ended up being fine, so we were able to kind of have a laugh about it, but pretty funny whenever you have one of those cameras and then something really silly happens and then you have that.
Put it on camera for all the world to see.
Yep.
We'll try to do that. I'm not sure how I got onto colonial America.
We were talking about demographics of the Western states. And we were talking about how eastern parts of the West Coast states were settled by Scots-Irish, and that got you to think about the book.
That's what it was.
That's how we got here.
So many tangents.
Yeah. It's one of the things we do best here at World Discussion with Agent Smith.
Well, did we have any other questions from earlier we wanted to get to?
Let me check. I think we got almost all of them. There was someone who was asking about a Kazakh rocket that was sent to Russia or something, and then they took it back. Not sure what that's about, but
Oh, what was that? That was like yeah, I think I remember reading about this. It was like a site. It was like it was a Russian launch site. I think that they basically took control over. I don't remember the details. When I first read about it, I thought they were going after the Cosmodrome.
mm-hmm.
You know, they were going after that like little bit of territory in Kazakhstan that the Kazakh government leases to Russia for their space program. I think we've talked about that before, haven't we?
I believe so. I've also seen like documentary of people sneaking in to look at that place.
Yeah, that's what I thought it was at first, but it turned out to be something different. So I don't remember exactly what that was about. I have to refresh my memory. I do remember, I didn't take notes on it. I do remember not taking notes on it because I didn't think it would go anywhere. I don't think it was like a significant indicator of any significant change in Kazakh foreign policy vis-a-vis Russia. You know, from what I remember, I think it was just like some legal procedural thing.
Mm-hmm.
Baikonur Cosmodrome. And it's like this weird little pocket of Russian territory right in the middle of Kazakhstan. Funky place. I think didn't wasn't there a guy bald and bankrupt? He's like a well-known travelogue YouTuber type guy. I think he got arrested trying to get into there or something not too long ago, didn't he?
Oh, I didn't know about that.
Yeah, he's gotten into a bit of trouble past couple months or past 6 months or so. I think he got arrested outright when he was in Uzbekistan.
They just like, we know who you are. We don't want you to do your thing here. Go away.
No, I think he was trying to get into some place he wasn't supposed to.
Oh,
That's kind of his thing. He takes risks.
yeah.
That's why he's so popular. He does some risky things, but that's to his credit that he generally is able to pull it off.
Mm-hmm.
But his luck ran out in this case. Yeah, he actually had an episode recently where he went to Kabul in Afghanistan,
Mm-hmm.
and he was just kind of walking around, which is a pretty bold move. You got to hand it to him. He doesn't lack for courage.
And a little bit easier to navigate the place as a man than a woman currently.
Yeah, yeah, for sure.
How are they
Yeah.
doing over there in their new setup? New old setup. They're hitting a retro style.
Yeah, yeah. Retro is very much in vogue right now in Afghanistan. It's about as bad as you would expect. They early on after they had taken control, they made some noise about maybe not being as extreme as they had been in the 90s, and maybe we'll go a little easier on the women and all that kind of thing. But over the subsequent, guys, has it already been 2 years? What was it? We left in 21, so about a year and a half thereabouts. So in the subsequent time since the United States withdrew from Afghanistan, they've basically just walked back all of those promises. They did it slowly and incrementally over time. So there wasn't any single point in which they said, you know what, fuck it, we're just going to put all the women back in the kitchen.
Mm-hmm.
But over time, that's kind of the trend. So they said originally that they might allow women to continue going to university, and then they started putting restrictions, and then I think a couple months ago they just said no, women cannot attend university. So a lot of people were pretty upset about that, but nobody really knows what to do about it either.
Yeah,
It's a
it's sort of them trying to dance the line. At least it seemed like this at the beginning, where they were like, no, we're going to be different and we're going to give women more rights and things than the full on old school traditions
Yeah,
to get aid and support from other countries and stuff. And also to build legitimacy, because the world doesn't currently recognize them as like a very legitimate government, especially
yeah,
because of the human rights violations.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, they part of the reason that they were so reluctant to just jump right back into, extreme this to jump right back into doing what they were doing in the 90s was because they needed money. The central bank had basically emptied its funds before they took power. And there was a big economic downturn because of the collapse in foreign aid, since obviously the West wasn't going to continue to, fund all that stuff, since they figured the Taliban would just end up stealing most of the money if they allowed them to continue operations at all. So, given how important foreign aid was to the economy, that was a pretty bad blow. And then there was also some bad weather, and so there were food shortages, which caused a lot of inflation. And 2021 was a year with significant inflation anyway, so they got double hit there in terms of inflation. So all told, they were hurting for money pretty bad, and so they decided to kind of take it easy as far as the old school, old time religion. But since then, since then, conditions have improved a bit, and there's also been a lot more dissent within the Taliban. Specifically, there's a lot of disagreement between what you might call moderate Taliban, in so much as there can be said to be such a thing. There was a lot of disputes between moderate Taliban and the more radical Taliban, as far as, just how extreme they should be in establishing Sharia law. And the moderates wanted, obviously they were very conservative, being Taliban, but the moderates were more interested in kind of allowing relatively more liberty, especially for women, than they had previously allowed in their previous incarnation in the 1990s. The radicals were not in the least bit interested in that. And the radicals were at first willing to entertain moderate notions of maybe incrementally imposing Sharia law, and maybe also trying to get access to foreign money in the immediate aftermath of the American withdrawal. But over time, they became less and less patient. And at this point, there has almost been open fighting at times, not necessarily violent fighting, but just like openly arguing about what they should be doing. And the Taliban does not want its coalition to fracture, because Afghanistan is already pretty fractured as is. And, if they do split, that could rekindle war in Afghanistan. In this case, a civil war between different factions of Taliban, along with their various warlord allies, and what will probably be a significant amount of proxy warfare on the part of foreign interested parties. So they've decided to give in to some of the demands of the radicals in order to try to pacify them. And as the radical pressure has grown, so too has a corresponding policy in Afghanistan. And that's probably a trend that's likely to continue, at least until some kind of consensus can be reached between moderates and radicals of the Taliban as to how they actually want to govern. Because right now they're still kind of finding their feet in terms of governance. We've talked a lot before about how, revolution is the easy part, governance is the hard part.
Who is that, Paul Ryan or something? He was like trying to pass a healthcare bill, and it was like, governing is hard. It's easier to look at someone else's bill and say, it's a shit bill, don't pass it, it's bad, you guys suck. But then to actually try to find your own bill that makes compromises that allow it to pass and also satisfy the people who want it is really hard to do.
Yeah, very much so. So the Taliban are struggling with that. Not so much, compromise. They're, an authoritarian government. They don't need to worry about that, but more so the administrative side, which also kind of requires give and take and, a certain amount of flexibility. And they're not very good at being flexible, at least when they're not being corrupt. When they're being corrupt, they're very flexible, quite malleable for the right price. But beyond that, yeah, they're struggling. I think Reddit in particular had a field day when it came out that there were complaints from one guy working for the Taliban in government in Kabul that he really did not like it, that he wanted to leave the Taliban because he did not like city life. He found his job working at a desk in an office very boring. He didn't like traffic in Kabul, which was very bad. And just in general, he felt that jihad had been a lot more engaging than the work of actually governing Afghanistan.
That's funny.
Yeah. Yeah, not quite as enjoyable as jihad, it seems. So I don't think the Taliban are going to give up power because they don't like office work. They're going to stick it out most likely. But yeah, that is an example of how they're finding it difficult to adapt their workforce of drug-addicted soldiers and whatnot to the tasks of governing a country of 30-some million people. So they got that going on. They've also got violence with the Pakistanis going. The Pakistanis were really looking forward to having an Afghanistan that they assumed would be a buffer state and a proxy state for them and their intelligence agency. And perhaps unsurprisingly, they have been disappointed. For their 20 years of supporting the Taliban through their war against the United States, the Pakistanis have been rewarded with endemic violence along their border with Afghanistan. It turns out that the Pashtun people of the Taliban and Afghanistan are not really that interested in helping out a Pakistani state that their Pashtun brethren in Pakistan are in a low-intensity conflict with, to use the military science parlance. Basically, Pashtuns in Pakistan are upset with the government for a variety of reasons, not least of which is what they see as over-policing and too much of a military presence, basically, in the northwest of the country, what the Pakistanis call the Northwest Frontier Province, which is where most of the Pashtun population lives. They're also a little bit upset at what they perceive to be some discrimination against Pashtun peoples in other parts of Pakistan. So the Pashtun population is a little bit restive, and there was already a pretty strong Pakistani Taliban, as they're called, which is basically Pashtun Taliban who live in Pakistan. There were Afghan Pashtun Taliban in Pakistan as well, but they mostly hung out in the city of Quetta over in Balochistan in southern Pakistan. So there was some ties between the Pakistani Taliban and the Afghan Taliban. They were both operating in the same country, but the Pakistani Taliban operated more in the Northwest Frontier Province and openly fought with the Pakistani army, incurring significant casualties for a long time up until the Pakistani army finally just launched a big operation to clear them out. They didn't defeat them completely, but they did enough damage that the incidents of violence in the province died down for a long time. But since Afghanistan was taken by the Taliban, Pakistani Taliban activity has significantly ticked up. And the Pakistani government has approached the Afghan government about the issue, asking them to try to help them curtail Pakistani Taliban activity in Pakistan. And the response from the people that the Pakistani government thought would be their proxies has been, no. We're not going to do that. So this is a classic example of what in the United States we would call blowback. The Pakistanis supported a proxy force in Afghanistan in the hope that they would be able to maintain their control and influence over Afghanistan against the will of both the local population and the United States. And for their efforts, they have now been rewarded with not insignificant militant activity on their northwestern border. If people were not suffering and dying, I might laugh a little bit. Just a cynical little bit of Schadenfreude there.
Yeah, I think we have, what is it called? It's not an appeal to nature. Maybe it's an appeal to tradition. But I think a lot of times you fall in love with an idea of something rather than the actual thing. And Sharia law, that's one that some people were really excited about. Like, we're going to bring back the old ways, the old laws and stuff. And some people were like, oh yeah, that was back when a lot of other cool stuff was happening. I'm sure this is going to be better. We could like make a country that has this. And then you actually enact it, and it turns out that it doesn't really hold up so well in 2023.
Nope. Especially in Kabul, which is a much bigger city than it used to be.
Mm-hmm.
I might add here as an addendum to this that the whole situation in Afghanistan has been and is now surreal. Because the collapse of the coalition government, the pro-Western government in Afghanistan was so rapid and so complete that people really did not have time to adjust to the reality that the Taliban would come back to power. And really, even the Taliban were surprised by how quickly they collapsed and how quickly they were able to return to power. And the result is that you still kind of have a certain amount of disbelief, I think, in Afghanistan. Like, there's still this relatively liberal bubble in the form of the city of Kabul in Afghanistan that has not really fully come to terms yet with the fact that they have been cut off from the modern world and that the Taliban are back in charge of their lives. And the Taliban, for their part, are just as mystified. Because again, Kabul has grown a lot. It's a much bigger city than it used to be. They do not know how to run a modern city.
Mm-hmm.
And they certainly don't know how to deal with all of these relatively modern people that are living there now. Much less of a problem in some of the smaller cities, and it's certainly not much of a problem in the rural areas, where the Taliban always had a lot more support. But in Kabul, yeah, it's very much oil and water right now as far as the government and the people they're governing. And it's just kind of weird. It's very strange. Like there's no new equilibrium yet that has been reached. There's no understanding between the Taliban and the people of Kabul yet. So they just kind of live side by side exceedingly awkwardly. Best of luck to them, but I don't really know what else I can do, or really what anybody can do at this point. I mean, I'd suggest leaving the country, but that's obviously very difficult to do right now and very dangerous for a lot of people.
Mm-hmm.
So they're just kind of stuck in this Sharia law fishbowl in the middle of Central Asia after 20 years of being granted something resembling a westernized lifestyle.
It's got to be really weird for the people who stayed, because I remember the pullout of the U.S. and how a bunch of people were all kind of scrambling to catch flights and stuff to get out before the new leadership was in. But then some people, maybe that wasn't an option for them or they chose not to. But yeah, that's definitely going to impact whatever it is they're doing. Any woman who had a job or was going to school is now not doing that.
Yeah.
It's going to be weird, especially if you had all those freedoms before and then they're suddenly taken away. In a way that
There's been a
seems
lot
kind of
of
worse than just not having the freedoms to start with and being used to that. It's like you had the freedom and then it's removed.
well, that's exactly it. There's been a lot of angst amongst Afghan women, especially the ones who were relatively educated.
Mm-hmm.
I remember there was one story about an Afghan woman who had been working on her PhD at a university in Afghanistan. And they cut her off when she was working on her dissertation. So she's not going to be able to finish now, despite putting in all of that effort to try to make it to the end of the process. So, as somebody who's been in a PhD program, that really, really sucks.
Yeah, that's years of your life that basically burn up in an instant if you can't transfer that to something else.
Yeah, I'm really hoping that she'll be able to find some kind of alternative there, but it's going to be hard. Yeah, there was a lot of underground education in Afghanistan. That's what had happened in the 1990s when the Taliban were last in power. Girls could still get education, but it had to be done clandestinely.
Mm-hmm.
And so that activity has resumed. There are people doing that again. But the scope is not nearly as great as what could be done if it were just legal, what they could have been, well, compared to what they were doing before.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, speaking of for, liberal Afghanis, I think the principal reaction has been one of defiance, but also lots of despair. Like they write letters and make videos to BBC News a lot, and it's very sad stuff. They play them on the radio,
Mm-hmm.
and make and they'll also post articles on the BBC News website, and all of them are sad stories. Like it's really hard out there, especially for women, and they just don't really know what they can do. But what little they can do, they're doing. They have gone out and protested, much to the confusion of the Taliban fighters there. They don't quite know how to handle that.
Yeah, that's the thing with any sort of rebellion or overthrow is all the people who, like this office guy, they were trained to do violence. And with a protest, you're supposed to manage violence, but you're not supposed to just run over the people because that's your population, that's your community, that's also your economy, all that.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely
Yeah,
an
they've
interesting story that's developing because we've talked about this since like ISIS and stuff of the power vacuums that are out there and how it's really difficult to establish norms of good governance, and how it seems like they're pretty far off being able to settle into that. And you've got a bunch of rival factions still kind of fighting with each other and taking really, really extreme views, which I think also attracts people who are interested in those ideologies. Like that's a place that you can go, and people live in the old ways and stuff, and that in a way concentrates the radical ideas.
Yeah, there is kind of a gateway effect where, they attract more like-minded people, and then it kind of snowballs. We haven't seen as much of that in Afghanistan yet. I think the U.S. government was pretty adamant about communicating to the Taliban that, if Al Qaeda came back or if they started supporting Al Qaeda again or a similar such organization, then we would make trouble for them, basically. We would make them regret it. It's not as though we hadn't done it before. So probably the Taliban perceived that as a credible threat, and for the most part, they seem to have been behaving themselves in terms of their support for international terrorism. So that's at least one positive note. That could change. That's not a permanent state of affairs, but for now, they seem to be holding to that, as far as I know. Yeah, liberal Afghans have protested. They've also made appeals to the Taliban themselves as far as Islamic governance. The protests are often just disagreeing with them and asking them to stop being, Sharia law proponents. But they've also taken a different strategy where they argue in terms of the details of Islamic law, right? They say, looking at the Quran, looking at Sharia law, it doesn't say that women cannot be educated. So why are you doing this? So, they make appeals in this fashion as well as the protesting. And, to a degree, those have, the Taliban have been relatively receptive to that, or at least some quarters of the Taliban, I should say, have been fairly receptive to those appeals. But I don't know if it's enough of the Taliban leadership to really make a difference. But it has made some impact, and it has been accredited. It has been credited for the Taliban being less extreme in their governance thus far as compared to the 1990s. Yeah, it's definitely an interesting story to watch. It's kind of fallen under the radar because there's drama elsewhere, but seeing if liberal Afghanistan, such as it was at the end of the war, seeing if they can survive the Taliban, whether their liberal culture, preferences, practices, customs, etc., whether or not everything that was built in 20 years of U.S. involvement in Afghanistan, whether any of that can really survive the Taliban. That is a very interesting and open question right now. So that is worth watching. We'll see.
I would think that it will, because the people who are being oppressed right now, who used to have some freedoms, are going to basically be concentrating all of their energy in trying to change that situation and maintain what they've learned. And if you're also looking at Afghanistan kind of suffering economically and not really being able to flourish, then they're going to be kind of dragging themselves through the mud until they reach some kind of breaking point. But I feel like they're going to have to catch up with modernity again pretty soon, just because of the persistence of good people. That's one of the things that I personally have faith in, is people who want to do the right thing are usually after more of a long-term win condition, and they're willing to make sacrifices to achieve that, as opposed to evil actions are oftentimes more short-sighted for personal gain. So I'm thinking the parents teaching the next generation of children is going to be pretty important for the future of Afghanistan. And even though they can shut women out of a lot of things, like this example of the lady who's working on her PhD, she's a super smart, very educated lady who is going to be teaching the next generation about all of the great things that women can do, and really encouraging them to try to find whatever openings they can to live their best life. So it's going to take a while to unfold. It sort of feels like with the U.S. being involved over there, we gave them a preview of more modern governance and society and that kind of stuff, but it wasn't enough to change all of their existing norms. So it snapped back a little bit. but it might have put some of that fire of just personal liberty in their heart.
Yeah, I think you make a good argument. The grand arc of history bends towards justice and all that.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, but to offer a counter argument, there was a communist government in Afghanistan for almost 20 years. No, no, less than that. It was more like 15, but pretty long time. And there's not much of that that's left. After the communist government collapsed at the end of the Cold War, and the Mujahideen moved in and took control, they were able to pretty radically change Afghanistan and undo a lot of the changes that had been made under the communists. Obviously not all of the changes the communists made were good. It probably was for the best to get rid of some of those changes. But to a degree, they had introduced modernity into Afghanistan as well. And the Mujahideen did not have that much trouble in undoing that in the 10 years or so they were in power during the 90s.
I didn't know about that.
Yeah, that's actually, it was because the communist government was able to survive for about a year or two after the Soviets cut them off from support, that the United States partly expected the Kabul government in Afghanistan to survive after the U.S. pulled out for at least another year or two. I remember reading that that was sort of the consensus in the intelligence community, that the communist experience was some kind of precedent that we could kind of look to.
Mm-hmm.
And boy, did they end up being wrong. It was one of the big L's in intelligence analysis history. They missed the mark on that by a country mile. But yeah, the communist government did have legs for a while, and it did have some support within Afghanistan. But man, the Mujahideen went hard when they were in power, right?
Mm-hmm.
A lot of the modern people were chased out. People who had served in the communist government were outright killed frequently. I think he was the president of the communist government, was actually hunted down some years after the war had ended, and he was murdered.
Damn.
By the Mujahideen. Yeah, that actually was one of the reasons I was surprised to hear when the U.S. was pulling out that Hamid Karzai actually came back. I would have thought he'd be terrified of being murdered, but apparently he came to some kind of accommodation with the Taliban, and he's actually just kind of hanging out in Kabul now.
Interesting.
Yeah, it's pretty wild stuff.
We'll see where that goes.
Yeah, I'm hoping they don't do what they did in the 90s again. I'm hoping they don't, because they can still crack down. They haven't cracked down yet. There hasn't been like this violent purge of Afghan society where they try to uproot any and all liberal influences from the West. And it is something they could hypothetically do. And I don't doubt it's something that the radicals in the Taliban want to do. And about the only thing stopping them at this point is the moderate Taliban. And there's no telling how long they'll be able to hold them back. So, maybe they continue to be relatively, I don't want to say conservative, that's not quite the right word, relatively moderate in their governance, or maybe they go like full fucking Pol Pot, and we end up with a huge massacre. Like, you can't really rule anything out completely at this point.
Yeah, we've been wrong with a lot of the predictions in that area up to this point, so
Yeah.
it's anyone's guess.
Yeah. Really hope they don't go Pol Pot. That was a very ugly period of Cambodia's history. I wouldn't wish that on anybody, but you never know. Radicals are not known for their rationality or forbearance.
Mm-hmm. Well, cool. I think we may wrap it up here and get ourselves some rest. Thank you, Agent Smith, for coming on as usual, and thank you, chat, for your contributions, lovely questions, corrections, and scathing reviews.
Thank you for the feedback. Always appreciated.
Yeah. I kind of joke about it a little bit, but I really like harsh criticism, especially when it's in the form of YouTube comments. So if you really have harsh opinions about me or us or this segment, make lots of YouTube comments. It helps the algorithm. And we'll be sure to weave in those corrections. As usual, I will challenge you with your 20-minute walk this week. I hope you don't have terrible weather. Last time, I think you told me you were like going through the wind and the rain or something.
Oh yeah, I got drenched that one time. It just opened up on me when I was like halfway through.
You're like, Neuro, you did this.
It was my own fault. I knew the rain was coming. I just didn't think it would get here before I got back.
That's the
And that
thing,
even
though.
if it,
Texas rain, it comes from a bucket. It's not like a nice
oh
mist
yeah,
that starts.
oh yeah, I thought, okay, it'll start to drizzle a little and then it'll pick up. And then by the time it starts coming down, I'll be back home. No, it started to drizzle and then it just came down like all at once.
Hmm.
Just bang. Say la vie.
Yeah, and we have a nice Easter egg in this episode for those of you who wanted to know Agent Smith's go-to pizza. It's going to be in the VOD, which will be posted to YouTube pretty soon.
Everybody has different tastes, but I feel that that is a very strong pizza.
Yeah.
That's something I evolved over time experimenting. I don't recommend anybody be a fat ass, but I have historically been one. And among the vices of the fat ass is experimenting with junk food.
I would
And
be
so,
more concerned about you if you were making yourself a pizza that you didn't like and you didn't have much faith in. That would just be bad purchasing.
imagine asking somebody for their preferred pizza and they give you their preferred pizza, but then they add at the end, preferred pizza, but I want you to know it's a very weak example. I will not go with that.
Put faith in your pizza, Agent Smith 2023. Well, thank you
Oh,
as usual. Yeah.
quick point, quick point here. There was a guy asking in chat here since I opened it up. He was asking about lithium in Afghanistan. Yeah, they did find deposits there. There's a bunch of mineral deposits in Afghanistan. Lithium, no surprise that there's lithium there. The problem is not resources or lack of resources. They have quite a few. The problem is extracting the resources. In order to get those resources, you would need to build up infrastructure so that you would have, roads, airports, et cetera. Well, not airports, but roads, railways, et cetera, that you could use to move the material out of the country. And more importantly, you would need to have enough security in the country to give investors confidence that they would be able to invest in the country and get their money out without having their operation shaken down or extorted by radicals, militiamen, warlords, Taliban, or what have you. And right now, there is not sufficient confidence for that to happen. The Chinese government has made some noise about reaching something resembling an agreement, probably more of a handshake agreement with the Taliban about exploiting resources in the country, but most likely, unless the Chinese government just points a gun at a state-owned bank manager's head and says, you have to invest in this, most likely they're not going to find a lot of takers in the Chinese economy for that, even given the fact that the Chinese government has such a strong role. So, yes, there's lots of resources, but there is not realistically any viable way to get them out because of insecurity in the country. If the country does settle down, maybe then it becomes viable. There's significant challenges even then, just because of the geography of the country and the expense of it and the expense of trying to extend infrastructure there. But for now, the security question is the big one, and it really does not look like a stable country right now, right? Given the tensions between the moderate and the radical Taliban, given that there are warlords throughout the country that are still wield significant power. Keep in mind, the Taliban did not have to conquer most of Afghanistan when they blew through. As the United States withdrew, what they did is they cut deals with local warlords that had been pro-government and and then as part of those deals, had them agree to become, or at least align with the Taliban. But that allegiance to the Taliban is, as always, with warlords, it's conditional. It's mercenary. Like they don't have to stay loyal, and keeping them loyal is difficult, right? They have to have access to money. They need to make sure that they have control over their territory, and they want to be able to run their territories how they like. And it may be that they do something or prefer something that the Taliban doesn't like, and that could create tension. Probably the radicals will be the genesis of that tension. They're the ones that are more likely to want to go and force warlords to do things they don't want to do. The moderates will probably prefer to sit back and let it slide, just out of the interest of maintaining stability. So again, it just depends on how the balance of power kind of moves within the different factions, within the warlords, the moderates, and the radicals. And there's also a nascent insurgency in the what was it? There's a valley north of Kabul where the Northern Alliance used to kind of hold up. That was their base of support. So people there are still pretty upset about the Taliban coming to power, and they have been pretty restive. There have been reports of insurgent activity against Taliban soldiers, guerrilla attacks, hit and run attacks, that kind of thing. And so that has the potential to spin out into a larger insurgency depending on how unstable the country becomes. So all of that lends very little confidence to Afghanistan as an attractive locale for significant amounts of money. It's not the kind of place you look at and think, you know what, I would love to have billions of dollars at risk here. Not really. Not
Yeah.
going to happen. So yeah, they got a lot of resources, but they're not going to be able to get them out of the ground until they stabilize. And Afghanistan most likely is not going to stabilize for a very long time.
Yeah, you need trust.
Yeah.
Yeah, good luck. So, lithium, sure. Good luck getting it. Well, cool.
So
Appreciate you coming on as always.
Oh no, my pleasure. It's a privilege to be on here, and I appreciate it.
Heck
I
yeah.
appreciate that you carve out the time for me.
This is a great segment. We've created a baton system for asking if you're going to be online. If anyone asks if Agent Smith is going to be online on a Sunday and I say yes, it's their job to answer the next chatter. And it actually saved me a headache today because there were like 4 times where that happened, where someone said, "Is Agent Smith coming on today?" And then someone in the chat said yes. I looked over and I just smiled, knowing I didn't have to answer that question because it was taken care of. So you have a lot of fans. Always good to have you on.
Well, thank you and everyone else for their support. Always appreciated. And thank you for being patient with me.
Hell yeah, dude. We all need to be patient with each other. The world's a pretty crazy place.
Yeah, it is at that. It is at that.
Well, you take care of yourself, and we will see you on the next episode of Well Discussion with Agent Smith.
Yes, sir. Thanks again. Talk to you next time.
GG. Nice.